it's me. Hopefully it's me. I've dropped so many frames. But I think we're here now, which is what matters in the end. We're gonna listen to me. Ha ha ha. I'm inflicting myself upon you. Let me move. No. What moving? What is that? This. Where am I? Where's my body? Where is the body? Yeah. Move this down. And move this down. There we go. Move that down. It exists now. What we're gonna do is we're gonna listen to a story. What I'm telling and what I wrote in during several Novembers. You tell that I'm slightly out of practice. I know last time we were reading my book, we got to like chapter 33, I think. But I haven't gone and checked that. And I know that like hardly anyone was there. If you're here, we're gonna start at chapter 30. At some point, I think, let me see what command is. Do I have one? I actually finally fixed the Discord one, which is helpful. Here we are, I do have one. Ha ha ha. Here's where my book is. My hellscape that is Wattpad. It's a book about dying because you spilled beef noodles on a keyboard. It's a book about ending up in the heavenly realm and them having like no idea what to do with you. Because you're in the body of a god who has no one that believes in them. Because you've been almost dead for 4,000 years. And humans don't remember things for that long. It's about filing papers. It's about paperwork management. It's about questioning why heaven has analog paperwork when it's heaven, and why, just why, a lot of whys. It's also the first thing I've written in about 15 years because I used to write Harry Potter fan fiction and I wrote a really popular one and people used to send me death threats. They didn't like the pairing that was tagged. We love how people don't read that and then complain about the pairing. But we're here. I'm willing. Oh, if anyone has any questions, I'm willing to answer them. But we're just gonna casually make our way through the book as it comes out. This is maybe like the 4th stream I've done of it. Like I said, got to like chapter 33 last time, but we're starting at 30 because I don't remember anything that happens at this point in the book. I'm on to like editing chapters in the like late 50s right now. We do have stream closed captioner on. It's 'cause, oh, there we go. Thank you, Streamcast Caption, for reminding me. Kind of important during a reading stream? Maybe not, because it rarely knows anything that I'm talking about. But here we go. We're gonna start. I should probably read the table of contents. The description. Uh, so I transmigrated into the heavenly realm by reflections on the pole, who is also me, your favorite pastry-based life form, Tiny Hedgepig. Content warning: blood, mild gore, psychological horror. I'd probably say like medical inaccuracy, some ableism, and just bad people doing bad people things. Um, on people in positions of power, not using that in the best way possible. Dax Moonfield just wanted to pass his university entrance exam. They had other ideas. After an interesting accident involving a pot of instant noodles and a computer keyboard, he found himself in the heavenly realm. Life as the beloved god of wheat isn't simple. Overprotective deities, a body that's damaged, and a severe lack of believers are just some of the hurdles. Dax. And who is that super buff guy we keep running into and everyone keeps steering me away from? System. Wait and see. And I have to remember my system voice. I'm not happy. Chapter 30. Paperwork Mountain. Dax now finally free to do his work, with a dining table chair in tow and a bag full of cheese bread twists. One of the guards at the gate had given it to him for lunch. Reopened the door to the prayer office. Precariously stacked papers that he and Ulrich had stuffed back into the room haphazardly the other day began tumbling out again. A veritable waterfall of paper that made Dax glad that he had chosen to stand behind the door and not in front of it. Once the mass had stabilized and no longer seemed like it posed a threat to swallow him whole, Dax sighed in relief. He was standing in the hallway, and the spilled papers were already up to his mid-calf in depth. Despite here we go, first time I trip over my mouth today. Despite so many having fallen out of the doorway, the prayers in the room were still densely compacted, blocking any view of the room's interior. It looked more like a large piece of chipboard was covering the entrance, rather than a pile of papers. They were so densely compacted together. Looking at them, just viewing them at all, was stressful. Every single paper in there was a wish, a prayer that a believer had sent to him, sent with the belief and hope that it would be fulfilled. Not sent to you, Dax reprimanded himself. Sent to Dethos. You're just borrowing his body right now. You aren't him. The weight of responsibility truly settled itself down onto his shoulders now. Doing the work of an actual god was a little different than lounging around his house, looking at and perusing his left behind items. A question burrowed its way into the forefront of his mind. Where do you start when you can't even get into the room? To get into the prayer office, Dax was going to have to remove a large volume of the papers, and rather than just stuffing them into another room, it was probably for the best to start triaging them. As he had absolutely no idea how to fill the prayers, and probably wouldn't until he managed to access the room they were currently rammed into, and developing a better filings. Okay, I need to edit this sentence. This is a good thing to notice. Truly, I like this. You look at something so many times that like the typo just misses you every time somehow, and then you read it and you're like, this makes no sense. Uh, as he had absolutely no idea how to fulfill the prayers and probably wouldn't until he managed to access the room that they were currently rammed into, it was paramount that he developed some form of better filing system. The only way that Dax could see of doing that right now was taking all of the prayer papers out of there and somehow sorting them into piles. There was definitely plenty of space to do that. The Palace of the Wheat God was nothing but endless rooms and corridors. Surely Dax would be able to find a way of sorting them that felt less overwhelming. Once filed properly, it would be considerably more efficient to fulfill them once he actually knew how. Speaking of efficiency, it was baffling that the Heavenly Realm had such an inefficient way of dealing with prayers in the first place. Why use paper at all? Sure, for small deities with equally small followings, it was a nice way of having a personal rapport with your believers, but it had to quickly spiral out of control. Even if you had staff to help you, Dax couldn't imagine that even the deity with the highest dedication to work ethic even the deity with the highest dedication to work ethic, heck, even the deity of work ethic, would become overwhelmed and burnt out with such an analog method. This was going to be something he would curse colourfully about regularly in the future. Floor and table space within this palace were certainly sufficient for laying the prayers out. There seemed, so far at least, to be no end to the amount of rooms it contained, and Dax hadn't even been able to find a single way of getting to the first floor yet. Space was assuredly first yard of stream. Dum, 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 dum. Floor and table space within this palace was certainly sufficient for laying the prayers out. There seemed, so far at least, to be no end to the amount of rooms it contained, and Dax hadn't even been able to find a single way of getting to the first floor yet. Space was assuredly not an issue. Mechanical pressure and the sheer amount of time posed a larger problem in extracting the prayers. In the hours and days, if not weeks to come, there was going to be a considerable amount of delicate unfolding of fragile paper. So far, he had only been able to open one, and that had been terrifying. His hands shook just thinking about touching it. The God of War's prayer Dax had read last night was one of the more intact and structurally sound looking ones. At the edge of the papers that spilled out onto the hallway floor, Dax sat ready to start this overwhelming task. He picked up the prayer nearest to him, reverently, and attempted to open it. He swore immediately as it began to tear along one of the folds. "Digitize!" he shouted into the emptiness of the palace. It was so loud that the guards posted at his gate were startled and wondered whether they should come investigate what was going on in there, but in the end they didn't dare leave their posts. "Isn't there a deity of IT?" Dax asked, frustrated, attempting to peel apart the layers of the paper as if it were made of butterfly wings, and even breathing on the surface would cause it to crumble into 10,000 pieces. He wondered whether he should be wearing gloves to do this, but decided that it would have made doing this even harder. There isn't a deity of IT, but there is a god of IT problems. He's called Rebootium, Lord of the Backed Up Hard Drive, System responded, finally making itself known again. Dax swore loudly in shock. He'd forgotten that the system was still hanging around. He coughed, choking on his own spit, whilst said system looked on at him in judgment. It always seemed to think that he should be doing a better job than he was, but refused to explain what exactly it was that Dax should be doing instead. Several hours passed as he attempted to gather together, open and read prayers. The bag he'd brought, filled with cheese bread twists, had been emptied, eaten, and stuffed to the brim with processed prayer papers. All along the corridor, he'd made different piles to put them in, according to the subject matter contained within. Dax had spent a great deal of time ferrying the prayers from the larger mass to their allotted pile with his bag. The pile of "please don't die" prayers had grown so large during the last 2 hours that there had been no other option than to quarantine them to a room of their own to prevent the stack from collapsing under its own weight and mixing with the piles on either side of it. There was no way that Dax was going to make even more work for himself later on by not separating them now. Luckily, there had been an empty room, void of any furniture or decorations, just a little further down the corridor. It was easily able to contain them. Although it didn't have any windows, there was a domed skylight that gave enough light for Dax to be able to see what he was doing. Welcome back, you've survived. You've survived the ad break, and I'm very proud of you for that. Although it didn't have any windows, there was a domed skylight that gave enough light for Dax to be able to see what he was doing. The god of war really didn't want someone to die, Dax pondered, whilst looking at the sheer chaotic mess this room had become. Wouldn't it have been easier to pray to a healing deity or a death god than Dethos? The pile in front of him should probably be multiple piles to give it some structural stability, and so he moved to rearrange it. To pray this many times? He must have really cared for whoever it was, Dax said, looking at the glow of Systems orb as he organized it into individual piles of 100 prayers. There was no real reason for choosing this number, it just seemed like a nice round number. Systems orb glow dimmed gradually as he did so, almost to the point of going out entirely before it fled an almost red color. That person was / is you, the people that I have to deal with these days, it sighed. Why? Dax asked, stunned. It's a good thing. You didn't transmigrate into the body of one of the deities of knowledge and or intelligence. Otherwise, we would both be out of a job. But it would have been very entertaining whilst it lasted. Helen, enjoy the look. Thank you for being here during this very technologically struggling stream. And me struggling to remember anything that I've done. This book. I'll also forget to do Systems voice 90% of the time. But we're going to strive to at least try. I hope you're having a good time. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Where else? Dax didn't respond to Systems or see behavior. He was too busy thinking about this sudden revelation. The god of war and he had barely even talked to one another since he had woken up in the healing halls. He'd found himself being rushed past him by guards when they had met in the palace of the Emperor of Heaven that time, and any other time that they had crossed paths outside said god of war had all but ran away from him, almost to the point where Dax had wanted to ask the god whether he stank or something. Stinky. Dax had started to believe that maybe Dethos and him had a bad relationship with one another. The way other people were reacting was highly suspicious, and it had reaffirmed for him that something had definitely happened. Though he hadn't wanted to ask about it too much in case that made people ask more questions about his memory loss. So far, Dax had been politely acknowledging him whenever they crossed paths, but that might have been completely out of character for Dethos to do. Maybe they had been on bad terms before he died. Maybe they had been best friends and him being so formal was hurting the other person. It was very stressful. The threat from the system not to act out of character was still hanging over him, though in regards to this it hadn't so much as given him a warning yet. The sooner that he could redeem the name tag purchase, the better. This here we go, I'm forgetting to do the voice. This plot point is one you have to unlock yourself, System said, displaying how many points were still left before the product of his wishes could be redeemed in a neon green flashing font. Mini theatre. Dax. How many trees got chopped down for all of this? System. They are just a metaphorical representation of the prayers sent to you. Dax, but why couldn't they manifest as an email? System. Does anyone ever read and answer email in a timely manner? Dax, I feel called out. System, you should. End of chapter 30. Now I attempt to find where we are because we love how Wattpad doesn't show you that. We are. Chapter 31. Red letters lie waiting. Dax spent a further 2 hours sorting and ferrying the papers back and forth. It was tiring work, and as he looked back at the mess of papers that was still covering the floor from the earlier avalanche, he was once again hit with the sheer scale of the task he had undertaken. Maybe it would have been a better idea to fulfill them one at a time. It would probably be less of a mess, but he'd already started and didn't want to abandon the hours of work that he'd already completed. He was literally, he was, he was finally overcome by the work when, as he walked down the corridor to deposit more please don't die prayers to their own assigned room, the gentle gust of air caused by his walking disturbed the papers crammed into the prayer room. The stacked papers were so unstable that even this was enough to set off a second avalanche of prayers, which spread across the floor. Luckily, none of the carefully sorted piles of prayers were affected, but seeing the clear areas of floor that you had just uncovered filled back in again was disheartening. It felt like the 2 hours of work that Dax had put into being able to see the floor again had been completely pointless. There were just too many prayers. He looked at the open door, and what lay beyond it, the solid mass of paper, appeared as if nothing had happened, and Dax hadn't already processed thousands of prayers. It was going to take a while to process, Dax thought, as he waded back through the stacks once more, careful to not actually step on any of them. That seemed like it would be beyond disrespectful. Processing them is just the first part of it as well, he thought, pinching the bridge of his nose, the bridge of his nose, to try and fend off the migraine he could feel building. Normally, he would have given up at this point, but the little piles of prayers that he had been sorting through gave him motivation to keep forging ahead with the task at hand. Being able to do something for Dethos made him feel less bad about all the other things he was messing up. If System said the sole reason he was here was to deal with this paperwork for the weak god, it would have been believable. Right now it was feeling more like Dax had landed himself in an incredibly weird version of purgatory than a second chance at life. His attention was drawn back to the steadily filling room now dedicated to please don't die prayers and the sheer number of them. Surely after reading so many of them and noticing that they were entirely sent by one person, as far as he could tell, it would be best to try and deal with them first. He was constantly finding them among the prayers that had spilled out onto the floor. No doubt there was also a significant number of them still trapped within the prayer office as well. Dealing with them would probably clear up a large space within the room and make it easier to deal with the others. After all, Dax had already filled half a room, dedicated purely to them. System chimed a congratulatory and quite lengthy tune before softly shifting its glow's hue through the colours of the rainbow, not unlike the ill-fated RBG keyboard that had brought him here, Dax thought amusedly, before returning to its signature golden colour. Congratulations on the completion of your first 1,460,000 prayers. 1,460 points have been deposited in your account. Dax smiled. He'd finally been able to earn some points, and it hadn't even been that hard to do. It would have been great if the system hadn't left him to sort thousands of prayers before deeming this one fulfilled, though. Answering the remaining prayers was certainly going to be a grind fest, but he was Answering the remaining prayers was certainly going to be a grind fest, but he was someone that may have been uniquely designed to do it. Who better than an MMORPG player to fulfill this tedious side quest like task? He hadn't played Land of Conquest Artistry for 10 years to be beaten by a sorting minigame and a fetch quest. You have no idea how many wolf pelts he had in his inventory or portions that he was hoarding for the day when he would finally use in-game items. You now have enough points to unlock both purchasable items from the system item shop, System informed him. I'd like to purchase both, Dax excitedly exclaimed. Who didn't like purchasing quality of life upgrades entirely with in-game money? You can only purchase one upgrade at a time, System warned. Dax cursed under his breath and chose the most practical of the two choices. Screw time gates, he thought, as increased download speed began downloading very slowly from the system shop. At the very least, this would help speed things up going forward. The screen showing the download closed, and Dax was left looking at the space where the pile of prayers had been contained in the room. The god of war must really have spent a lot of time praying, Dax stated thoughtfully as he emptied the last few prayers that he had gathered out of his bag, placing them on their assigned piles or creating new ones. Some crumbs of paper and a fine dust fell out as he did so. At least once every day for 4,000 years, System informed him, rapidly calculating the maths for him in an almost unreadable font. As he looked on, the pile of prayers began to glow a soft gold, not unlike that of the system's own orb, before they disappeared into thin air. Somewhere deep within the prayer room there was a sound of moving paper for several minutes until the mass settled once more. Decompressing prayers expanded to fill the spaces left behind by the fulfilled prayers of the god of war. Surprisingly, there wasn't a third avalanche, and that he was very grateful for. Dax walked back into the corridor, waded back through the now knee-deep papers, and began rescuing his carefully stacked and organized prayers. He carried them to a larger sitting room at the end of the corridor, where they would no longer be at risk of being swallowed by yet another collapse of the structurally unsound prayer office papers. Once they were all settled into their new home, complete with increased security, Dax turned to ask System a question that had been on his mind for a while now. Why are these prayers written in red ink, but not those of the god of war? At first Dax had thought that the difference in colour was just the letter writer's own stylistic choice, but almost all of the letters written in red ink were more damaged than those written in blue or black ink. Sometimes black ink could fade in the sunlight and look a kind of reddish brown. There was no way that any of the ones he had sorted through, though, could have seen sunlight in a very long time, and the red that stained them was a vibrant blood red colour. System was quick at answering his question for once after scanning the prayers in question with its optical laser. Those are the prayers of people that have died. And I forgot to do System's voice. Those are the prayers of people that have died. Dax reached down to the nearest stack and reverently picked up a rather battered-looking one, as if it was made from bone china, before gently stroking his fingers over the red inked letters it contained. Can they still be fulfilled? He asked, thinking of the person that had waited so long only for their prayers to go unanswered in their lifetime. Dax sighed. Something like this must feel even worse if it's you that they're praying to, he thought. Yes, otherwise the paper it was written on would have disintegrated into nothing but powder or completely disappeared altogether, System informed him, as it bobbed up and down, acting like it hadn't just said something truly heartbreaking. Dax looked down once more at the prayer he was holding, and just how damaged it truly was. Tears started to well up in his eyes. Even in death, these followers had truly believed in deities. Now all they had was him to attempt to prove that their belief had not been in vain, and Dax didn't know if he could do that. If the thought of the tasks laid before him hadn't been overwhelming before, it truly felt so now. Through the sitting room window, Dax could see the full moon rising. Second yawn. The full moon rising as he sat among the proof that Dethos had been loved so dearly that even in death his believers trusted that their prayers would be answered. Minithia. Prayer 1. Pick me next. Prayer 2. He's gonna pick me. Prayer 3. Pick me, I'm more squashed. Pick 4. I'm more damaged. Prayer 5. I'm on the actual floor right now. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32. Moonlight Meeting. Under the light of the full moon, Elgaldi was using the sneaking skills he had learned as a martial god to get into the palace of the weak god unseen. It wasn't known for his abilities skill-wise, but it did come with the territory of his position. So no one could call him terrible at it either. Elgaldi had been warned by multiple deities at this point. Are we still alive? Are we going down? No, we're still here. Scared me for a second there. It wasn't terrible at it either. We're distracted, sorry. Elgaldia had been warned by multiple deities at this point specifically to stay away from Dethos, but Mother Willow had told him he needed to be here tonight. Predictions were never wrong, and that was the driving force helping him to overcome his own fear of seeing Dethos again. However, she probably hadn't envisaged his method of gaining access to the property at the time. Right now he was attempting to shimmy over a wall covered in a thick layer of flowering vines. If anyone saw him right now, they would probably die of laughter. Drulvenus had ensured that the front gates to the palace were manned by guards all hours of the day and night, ostensibly to keep out sightseers and keep Dethos safe, but Elgaldia knew it was to keep him away. Not that they were going to stop him from getting in tonight. He knew there was a secret entrance, and he knew where it was, and they didn't. In the past, on nights when Dethos and Elgaldia had both wanted to sneak out and go look at the stars in Mother Willow's garden, or go sit in one of the lower city bars, the secret entrance was the way that they had taken. Going out that way meant that no one could see them, and neither of them would get waylaid with paperwork that everyone said needed to be filled out right that second, but could actually have waited 3 weeks. Dethos and the goddess of motherhood were neighbours, and between the two palaces was a narrow alley capped by a tall wall covered in flowering vines that no one had bothered maintaining. 1 second, because my mouth is so dry. Oh, there we go. Refreshed slightly, maybe, I don't know. Dethos and the goddess of motherhood were neighbours, and in between the two palaces was a narrow alley capped by a tall wall covered in flowering vines that no one had bothered maintaining. Right now the small space was filled with knee-high weeds, but there had been pleasant and tasteful mosaic flooring 4,000 years ago before it had been walled off. At the point where the two palace walls bisected, there was a hidden door that led into the palace of the weak god. It was masked on either side by the trailing tendrils and flowers of a white clematis. It took some time to find the door. The plant had grown so thickly over it now that it had sat unused for so long a time that it needed a considerably powerful shoulder shove from Elgaldia to open. Lack of use had rusted the hinges, and Elgaldia had to pull away a few strands of clematis that were impeding its opening. Once he squeezed his sizable bulk through the door, which he could have sworn was larger the last time he had done so. He had done so. I'm blinding myself by having a light mode to read this. And then Elgaldia had hid behind a camellia bush. There were so many to choose from that it was easy to find one large enough to hide him. He waited there for a few minutes to ensure that there wasn't any other guards in the side courtyard, and that he had not been noticed slipping in through a heavily creaking door. He didn't want to deal with Ulrich tonight. He didn't want to deal with anyone that reported to Ulrich either. What he was doing right now wasn't exactly something that was going to be easily explainable. It would probably lead to rumours floating around that neither he nor Dethos needed. Ah, yes, officer. I sneaked in through a secret door, only the occupant, who I murdered in a blood rage, and I knew in the middle of the night because an ancient tree spirit told me to via a prophecy. That would definitely go down well, and there would definitely not be any more questioning about it at all ever. Nope. The side garden was located shockingly at the right side of the palace and was lit by a delicate copper and yellow glass lantern that hung from equally delicate-looking hooks positioned among the camellias. A gentle breeze swung them from side to side, causing the light that they emitted to swing along with it. The sighing of the wind and the creaking of the lanterns wasn't enough to cover the faint sound of crying that he could hear coming from somewhere nearby. It was soft, something you could mistake for a wounded animal. Algaldi extricated himself from the bush he was currently hiding in, shaking flower petals all over the grass. Once he had escaped, the god of war went on the hunt for the source of the noise. As he walked as he walked as discreetly through the garden as he could until he found a small bush where the cries were emanating from. In the soft light of the lanterns, Algaldi could see the hunched-up form of Dethos. He bent down to get a better look. The smaller god was crouching between the branches of the bush, holding his knees, rocking back and forth. Tears were glistening on his cheeks, and blood was oozing from small scrapes on his arms and legs. In the lantern light, the blood glittered like molten gold, because in this world, gods and deities in general have golden blood. Because, it's cool. I don't know. It just was gold when I first started writing the story, and it's just gold. Presumably the scratches had come from the plant he was currently residing in. Elgaldia sat there unsure of what to do for what felt like a long amount of time, frozen by the fear he would make whatever Dethos was doing, and whatever he was going through, worse if he intervened, and that he would scare him if he looked up and saw a random martial guard crouching 2 meters away from him in the dark. Eventually, though, he did gather his thoughts enough to actually do something to help. After much thought, Elgaldia settled with trying to encourage Dethos to talk about what was going on, or getting him out of the bush, whichever he felt most comfortable doing. "Would you like a handkerchief?" the god of war asked, fishing one out from his inner pocket and dusting it off out of anxiety. He offered it to Dethos, reaching his hand into the bush, expecting it to be refused, but it wasn't. Dethos scrubbed his face with the handkerchief, peeking up at him from underneath, before turning his back to him. "If you don't want me to be here, I can leave, but you should probably get these cuts soon too," Elgaldia said softly. Wounds this superficial could already have healed themselves. Dethos's health. Things were bad. It was best not to dwell on that right now, though, and instead ensure his safety first. Rustling came from the bush as Dethos turned around once more, holding the handkerchief to his face. Elgaldia could see fresh tears brimming in his eyes, even in the low light, and his heart twanged with pain. "Fuck," Dethos said, as his hair became entangled in the twigs, branches, and thorns of the bush. A single bead of blood it run down his face. It rolled down his side of his face, from a scratch just to the side of his eye. The trail left behind it glittered in the low light as it made its way along the contours of the wheat god's face before dripping off of his chin and onto the ground. It took a while to cajole Dethos out of the bush. It took longer to gently untangle his hair from it. Elgaldia had no idea how Dethos had even managed to fit in the tiny space between the branches in the first place, without completely shredding himself to ribbons. Blackthorn. The berries were great for making alcohol, but harvesting them came at the risk of impaling your fingers on a myriad of thorns. Elgaldia took the handkerchief now loosely held in Dethos's hands and pressed it firmly against the cut to his face. It wasn't deep enough that it would need stitches, but it was bleeding profusely. "You're bleeding," he said, letting go of the fabric the moment the smaller god brought his hands up to his face to hold it himself. Elgaldia took a step backwards, aiming to give him some space, whilst he scanned him for any other injuries. There didn't seem to be anything more serious than the scratches he had already seen. Dethos's own hand reached out towards him, and for a moment the god of war thought that he was being handed back the handkerchief, but Dethos grabbed hold of him instead, not aggressively like he deserved. He deserved Dethos to grab him by the throat, to pummel him into the ground. No, it was tender. Softly Dethos had pulled himself into Elgaldia's chest and wrapped his arms around him. He was hugging him and crying once more. Elgaldia could feel his heart hammering away in his chest, and he held his breath, hardly able to believe that this was really happening. The advice given by Mother Willow had definitely been worth listening to, and following tonight, to think he almost hadn't come. That there had been a possibility that Dethos had spent the entire night alone crying in a bush in his garden was heart-rending. I said heart-rendering. Heart-rending. What am I meant to truly trash the feelings that were building with my inability to read? Fuck, Elgadia cursed at himself for how happy he was feeling in the presence of Dethos' distress. Shouldn't someone be with him right now? Why wasn't anyone looking for Dethos? He'd been in this bush for a considerable amount of time before he'd even gotten here. Where were the guards? Were they even looking for him? Had they even noticed that he was gone? Elgaldia smiled down at the weak god, glad to be of any help to him before cursing at himself once again. He didn't deserve to feel this way. These feelings were coming from him taking advantage of Dethos' memory loss. Dethos wouldn't want him here if he remembered. Being here felt like he was breaching the god of wheat's consent. Tears were still falling from the weak god's eyes, with no sign of them stopping any time soon. Elgaldia softened his rather stiff stance and gingerly began putting. For some reason, I spelt it putting. Patting is what I was going for. See, this is what I get for not reading it through aloud. Seeing it. Began patting Dethos' back. Slowly, as the two of them stood there, the pats became more rhythmic and confident. It was silent between the two of them, aside from the crying, and Elgaldia had no idea what to say. Right now, Dethos needed someone, and Elgaldia was the only person available. He could hit the God of War later if he wanted to. Increased affection from NPC character, system chimed out, once again cursed to only be heard by the customer it was attached to. What the fuck? Dax exclaimed loudly. He'd actually meant to think it, and at most only say it to the pesky system that had suddenly started tracking affection in a soft voice. Apparently, instead of that, he just screamed it at a man that had done nothing but help him tonight and whom he was currently wrapped around. The god of war's patting of his back instantly ceased, and the god almost flew. He left his arms so quickly. Right now, the face of said man and its expression held a very convincing scalded puppy feeling to it. It made Dethos feel like he'd done something terrible. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here, Elgaldia said, rubbing his sweaty hands on his trousers vigorously. The more he wiped, the sweatier they became. He apologized again and turned to leave. He didn't want to make Dethos uncomfortable. He didn't want any regrets with this Dethos. There were already too many. With the handkerchief given by Elgaldia, Dethos scrubbed his face, drying the tears that were still wet there. It looked like his cheeks were already sore from the salt contained in them, though it was hard to tell in the dim light of the lanterns. You're the one that sent all the prayers for me not to die, right? He asked, with eyes that were already puffy and red. Across from him, the god of war was opening and closing his hands gently, trying to regulate his emotions, just holding himself back from hugging Dethos, who was hurting so visibly. He hadn't thought that Dethos would find his prayers so quickly. Thank you for the follow, Integer? Inter. I'm just gonna call you Inter. Thank you for following. Welcome to the madness. Dethos would find his prayers so quickly. Thank you. You're a very nice person to spend so much time doing that. Ethos thanked him while still stabbing his eyes? Tabbing his eyes. We're not stabbing eyes. Not yet, anyway. Oh, God. With my inability to spell, my inability to read, what really is the street? Elgaldia shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his face picking up a tortured expression as he tried to find his own words. You only think that because you don't remember what I did to you, he eventually choked out. It was almost a whisper, but the self-loathing was very obvious in it. Dax, seeing this raw expression of self-loathing, decided to throw out his worries of not acting like Dethos in order to comfort the gods standing in front of him. So he cracked a joke and hoped for the best. Well, I can't even die properly. I'm not even joking. If you were too dangerous to me now, why would the others allow you to walk around freely? Dax had seen the looks deities of the heavenly realm gave the god of war when they were both in the same place. He'd seen how he was rushed out of rooms Elgaldia was in. Surely if he was actively dangerous to be around, no one would have let them meet each other again. There was also the possibility that the guards placed around him were just that bad at doing their job. A million prayers is a lot to send to anyone, Dax said. His joke had not been as funny out loud as it had sounded in his head, so he decided to pivot back to comforting words. He reached out to Elgaldia after seeing his own tears, filling his eyes, poised, ready to fall. Touching him felt like it would be too intrusive, even though he had grabbed hold of him so tightly before. So he held onto the other's sleep? I'm sleepy. But he grabbed hold of the other's sleeve, gently between two fingers. I'm tired. You smell nice. You should. Dax fell asleep, standing up with the speed of someone flicking off a switch, which is really how I feel right now. The crying really had taken a lot out of him. In his sleep, he slumped forward, losing all strength in his knees. It took Elgaldia a few seconds to notice what was happening before he rushed to grab hold of him before he fell to the floor. Now, with the weight of the other god in his arms, he lowered both of them slowly until he was sitting on the ground with Dethos in his lap. The moths that had been sitting on the bush were disturbed as the god of war's elbow knocked it, and their brightly coloured wings glimmered in the soft light. A petal had landed on Dethos's cheek, and Elgaldia reached hesitantly to remove it. But, pardon me, first burp of stream. It's really all happening right now. Elgaldia reached hesitantly to remove it, but in his hesitation, a puff of wind did the job for him. Mini theatre, Guard 1. Pretty quiet night. Guard 2. It's always quiet. I don't even know why we're here at this point. Arthur. Is to keep a certain war god out of here, but there was no way that was ever going to happen. Emperor of Heaven. Why are my entire staff incapable of keeping the god of war out of anywhere? Arthur, because you're sending zooplankton to fight a whale. End of chapter 32, she says, hopefully. Trying to remember whether this is chapter 32. Yes, end of chapter 32. Really? Like how it's taken us like an hour to read 2 chapters. Technically 3. But at least we're not dropping 1700 frames. Chapter 33. First meeting. Long ago, there had been a time where every newly emerged deity that had made the long and arduous journey of gathering and following, large enough to enter the heavenly realm, had received a personal welcoming ceremony. The senior deities had gathered together in a glittering array that had been carved out on the rock upon which the city now stood, and recited speeches. A new face was rare back then, and everyone fought to be the one to take their new junior under their wing. Times had changed. Even when Elgaldia and Dethos had descended up to the land of the deities in the clouds, that custom had fallen out of use millennia ago. As humans increased in number and their societies grew increasingly complicated, there was more need of deities, and more things for them to be deities of. What had once been a miraculous arrival at the top of the stairs leading from the mortal realm into the heavenly one was now a cramped commute. The sheer numbers of new gods, goddesses, and deities meant that those one-on-one welcoming things, from the Emperor of Heaven and the senior deities, were now transformed into elaborate entrance ceremonies, the sort where the senior members of Heaven corralled them into a large space to be spoken to en masse, like a university entrance ceremony. That was where Elgaldir and Dethos had originally met. Well, to be exact, they had met in the line of newbies hanging outside the venue before the ceremony, fussing over their clothing and trying to look like they belonged there, like they had already acclimated to the city that they had found themselves in and weren't terrified, like they already belonged. Getting to the heavenly realm was a journey in of itself, though there were more of them that made it now. The journey was just as hard as it had always been. First, the humans had to have something happen to make them believe in something new. The longer the world existed, the more and more you were competing with pre-existing beliefs in order to make your own name known. Not a lot of blue sky religious ideas left out there. But that new thing couldn't fall under the natural belief that they had in someone else and their skill set. Then the human belief had to solidify and give you an actual form. After that, you had to gather enough believers, fulfill some impressive prayers, have some sort of temple made in your name, and get noticed by the higher ups. Nowadays, they couldn't even do a welcoming ceremony like that. It was entirely impractical. Humans had created so many small gods that came and went as quickly as the seasons changed. They'd rocket in popularity and power before burning out and disappearing just as quickly. When Elgaldir and Dethos had been young, attending the welcoming had been a very formal event. That was why they were so bothered about their clothing standing in that line. No matter where they were from, no matter where they were from, or how many believers they had, everyone was dressed in their best. What that best could, what that best was, could vary wildly, depending on who you believed it. Who believed in you? Yes, because we're talking about gods. Who believed in you and what your area of expertise was? There had been a fashion for beautiful martial goddesses in skimpy, impractical armor and gods with spiky hair wearing the most heinous cargo shorts possible for about 100 years. You had to attend the ceremony as well in order to be formally accepted into the heavenly realm. The going was a great way of meeting and making friends with other deities that had ascended at the same time as you. Your heavenly cohort. Elgaldi remembered thinking back then that he had to make at least one friend there because he was really struggling to adjust to his life here. Going from the chaos of the battlefield in the human world to here was hard to cope with. Out of everyone there that day, he had zeroed in on Dethos because of his smile. It had been warm and inviting in a sea of bored and terrified faces. The weak god was shining. The line was long, weather much colder than had been predicted, and everyone was suffocating under the pressure to impress. Unknown, uncomfortable formality, leaving them to excessive politeness, lest they break some unfamiliar rule or accidentally be rude to someone important. Everyone except Dethos. Dethos, he'd been running his hands over marble railings, twirling in his gold-embroidered robes, dancing in the sunlight. Where there was fear, the god of wheat brought joy. Dethos had been smiling, the sort of smile only the truly happy to be there could. The sort of smile that came from a person for whom just being alive was enough to make them happy. That's what had drawn them together, a smile and the bravery to make the first move. At that time, Tethos didn't even have a name. He'd only just transitioned into having a humanoid form, and his believers hadn't even gotten round to giving him a name. Yet here he was, ready to be counted amongst the deities of the heavenly realm. Although they had both ascended at the same time, Dethos's belief started first. He'd just spent a very long time as an actual piece of wheat. Kind of hard to get up here if you were an actual anthropomorphic cereal grain. There were a lot of stairs, and it was hard to walk up them as a plant. It's the harvest season, Dethos had said when Elgaldi had inquired about his lack of a name. They're busy. When introducing himself that whole summer and autumn, all he'd been able to refer to himself with was God of Wheat. Ugaldi remembered him talking very excitedly about how cool it was to actually have legs and an actually really real body that could do stuff. Dethos had spent several hundred years as an actual piece of wheat, which, although kind of cool to hear about, had proved to be very restrictive. Now he could fulfill his prayers so much easier. Ugaldi hadn't even been the god of war then either. It was thousands of years before he would have to take up that mantle. In fact, he'd actually been the god of peace treaties when he had first ascended. The transition had been rather awkward. It was almost funny how now, after so many centuries later, he'd end up as the god of both war and peace. A destiny of forever having twice the paperwork to complete. People tended to forget his additional calling, his first calling. He had sat next to Dethos during their welcome ceremony, whether by luck or divine intervention. On the sacred scroll of names, the Emperor of Heaven had written theirs down, right next to each other. The ceremony had taken an almost painfully long amount of time, as each of them was called forward one at a time to receive their personal blessings from the Emperor of Heaven himself. Ethos was called before him, and had stood up, ready to walk down the many stairs to the platform. All, all of this was taking place on. At that moment, a pink petal floated into the roofless auditorium, buffeted by the wind as it languidly spiraled downwards. Out of all the surfaces that it could have landed on, the top of Dethos's head was where it actually ended up. Ugaldi had found himself smiling at that perpetually smiley, weird god, and leaning over to gently pick it out of his hair for him. Now that he could see it up close, he could see that it was the waxy petal of a camellia flower. History would say that they had both blushed when they had met eyes, but Ugaldi's memories only contained the red slowly creeping across the other's cheeks. This sentimental moment was broken by the annoyed coughing from the senior deity that had called Dethos down to be blessed. If either of them had gone to school, the look that they were being given right then would have brought back the goosebumps of remembrance. Ugaldi reached out and ruffled the smaller god's hair before giving him a playful shove to get him out on his way. What had only taken seconds had felt like a lifetime. It really had been the start of a lifetime. The god of war's reminiscence of past meetings was interrupted by the present, a present where another petal landed on the sleeping face of Dethos, whom he was still holding in his arms in the palace garden of the wheat god. This time, though, he was brave enough to reach out and gently pick it off for him, instead of leaving it up to the wind once more. A similar scene, but they weren't young anymore. Thousands of years had passed since they met, waiting for the acknowledgement that would allow them to start their careers as gods of the heavenly realm. They were still the same people, and yet they very much weren't. So much had changed since they had held hands, looking for an accommodation in the lower sea. He couldn't sit here with the other in his arms forever, even if he wanted to. Seeing his face once more was enough. It had to be enough. Mini theatre system. Congratulations for getting hugged by the god of war. Dax, I'm asleep right now. Why are you in my dreams? System. Perk of the job. Dax. Pervert. System. I mean, I don't deny that. Dax. Question mark, question mark, question mark. End of chapter. Yeah, I'm having a stretching break. So should you. Next chapter. Chapter 34. Room with a View. Waking up in an actual bed was such a strange experience that Dax wondered for a solid minute to himself whether or not he had returned to his own body. Upon opening his eyes, though, the bedroom that greeted him was nothing like the one he had been expecting back on Earth. It had to be at least 5 times the size. The bed itself wasn't overly large, probably a double, but it was carved out of what had once been a very old oak tree. The golden grain was perfectly waxed and very obviously well cared for. Various other pieces of furniture made out of the same wood filled the room. Bedside tables covered in knickknacks, a vanity with a bronze mirror, and wardrobes that he was itching to look through. There had there had to be some better fitting clothes in there than the two pairs he had right now. For one, the robes he'd woken up in the lake wearing were too big, and he had to keep pulling up the bottoms and trying to prevent the collar from slipping off his shoulders. Dax had been given a few plain sets of clothes during his stay in the healing halls. They fit him a lot better, but he hated the feel of the fabric. The worst when the fabric is bad. On the wall directly across from the bed was a small stained glass window depicting the harvest of a wheat field filled with wildflowers. The light that shone from it scattered a rainbow of light across the room. It was nice. A bedroom like this was somewhere really comfortable to sleep in. Dax hadn't even noticed the back and neck pain he'd been living with until now. Just one night of laying in an actual bed had completely gotten rid of it. He had no memory of getting here, and he wasn't particularly sure how he had actually found a bedroom at all in the first place. He'd been searching for one the entire time he'd been here in the palace, and all of those searches had been fruitless. Apparently, he just had to sleepwalk to find one. System, how did I get here? He asked as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Hopefully the system would know what had actually happened. There wasn't exactly anyone else he could ask about this right now without looking insane. He had the feeling the fact he needed to sleep was freaking out everyone enough on its own at the moment. The golden orb that had been hovering over the foot of the bed leisurely floated up to the bed before settling on the covers just above his chest. If an AI could sound tired, that was exactly how it sounded when the system answered his question. The god of war returned you to your bed and tucked you in last night after you fell asleep standing up, it explained. As always, its explanation lacked a lot of details. Dax felt like he needed to actually understand what it was saying. Oh, Dax said, memories of crying in a bush and having to be talked out of it by a rather patient god wearing the colour insignia of the War Department came rushing to the forefront of his mind. If Dax had been unsure if he was currently in Dethos's palace, even after seeing the stained glass window and the vase filled to the brim with dried ears of wheat, that made no sense. If Dax had been unsure if he was currently in Dethos's palace, even after seeing the stained glass window, comma should be that. The vase filled the vase filled to the brim with dried ears of wheat made everything certain. Assuming that he actually was currently sitting in a bedroom somewhere in the palace of the wheat god right now, that had to mean that El Galdi had seen the state he was in. He cringed. The sort of cringe when you feel when you want the ground to open up beneath your feet. This was definitely an embarrassing situation to be in. No doubt El Galdia had come to see him on official business, and instead he had to babysit a serial god having a mental breakdown instead. That was even without thinking about the sheer state of the palace right now. If Dax's mother had been here, well, he'd be cleaning for the next 8,000 years, and she would be apoplectic with rage at how messy the place was. It certainly wasn't fit for polite company. Ulrich and the other guards seeing his chaotic organization was one thing. El Galdia was another. For some reason, it meant a lot more to him that the god of war had seen the horror of his domicile's paperwork explosion than the rotating cast of guards that did nothing but stand around and watch him struggle. The sheer chaos that was his current state of prayer organization was enough to be embarrassed about for maybe the next 4,000 years. He was pretty sure that you weren't meant to pile them on the floor. That was probably sacrilegious or something. Dax kept expecting a deity of paperwork to come kicking in his door for crimes against the concept of organization. Right now he was dealing with the equivalent of 4,000 years worth of unread emails, so Dax wasn't being overly particular with storing them in a social media worthy aesthetic manner. Getting them out of the prayer room and organized by priority was vastly more important, but that didn't mean he wanted everyone to know what a state Dethos's paperwork was in. That was meant to be secret, even if Ulrich couldn't keep their nose out of his business. Dax was doing his best not to stain Dethos's reputation by making him look like the god of people who can't organize their shit. Thanks to the god of war, we're def- Thanks for the god of war were definitely in order after everything he had done for him last night. Dax would have to ask him how he'd found this bedroom, when he himself had barely been able to memorize the path from the front door to the prayer room, and from there to his recent favourite sleeping spot. Either he was a genius at finding his way around maze-like buildings, or Elgaldia had been here at some point. During the previous owner of the body's life. Either way, he was grateful to have been sleeping on a bed and not on the floor for at least one night. How did you thank a literal god? Did members of the heavenly realm give each other flowers? He had a garden packed full of them right now. It was something he had in abundance. Maybe sending an edible arrangement would be nicer. Chocolate dipped strawberries and pineapple cut into the shape of flower. Seemed like something most people would enjoy. A nicely decorated assortment of bread rolls. The small problem with that was that the members of the heavenly realm weren't actually supposed to feel hunger unless they were weak or injured. Maybe giving food would be seen as an insult. There was still so much he had to learn about the culture and traditions here. The last thing he wanted was to insult someone that so far had only been incredibly polite to him. Would sending fruit be considered an insult? Dax didn't want to risk it. Would praying to Elgaldi in return for all of the points he'd received as a result of his own prayers be a good method of reciprocation? It felt very intimate. Maybe too intimate. Thinking of points reminded Dax that it was probably a good idea to check on the download status of his new upgrade. After being trapped in a cave full of glowing mushrooms for several days, he didn't ever want to be in a place where he was put in the same position again. Being able to talk to the system, although often entirely unhelpful and frustrating, was at least somewhat comforting. The sort of comfort that came from knowing that you weren't completely on your own, even if you were trapped somewhere with an AI that insisted on being vague about things. How weird everyone was being around Elgaldia and himself existing in the same room as one another really hastened Dax's need to purchase the other upgrade too. It wasn't my fault that the server connection was bad in the cave of the healing spring, system complained, its glow once again becoming more orange in color. You turned up here too early. Dax was now actually properly sat up in bed. It was hard to talk to a glowing orb whilst laid down. Covers that had been so snugly tucked around him were now half hanging onto the floor. Dax wondered whether Elgaldia had to make the bed before putting him in it, or whether those covers had been on it since Dethos had left. If they had, there wasn't a speck of dust on them. That had to be some kind of magic. Too early? He asked as he swung his legs out of bed and onto the wooden floor beside it. He was very confused about how he could have come here too early, and wanted clarification sooner than later. Why would you spill instant noodles on a computer keyboard? System lamented. It sounded like they were taking it both as a personal insult and as if Dax had personally murdered one of System's own family members. You're worse than the guy that choked to death raging at an online novel. I was hungry, Dax exclaimed. He really had been hungry as well. Anxiety-based nausea because of the exam he was resitting had prevented him from eating anything the night before his exam, and on the day off, that had meant that by the time he had reached the internet cafe that evening, he was starting to feel faint. You couldn't read. You couldn't read. I can't read. Apparently. You couldn't raid in an MMO RPG on an empty stomach. That was just a fact of life. We all know that. We all know that. Right. Why is it's alright? There we go. There we go, there we go. Saved my eyeballs. Blah, blah, we murdered that. No, no, no. You couldn't raid an MMORPG on an empty stomach. That was just the fact of life. It took literal hours, and that was with a raid team filled with competent people. So he'd ordered instant noodles. Beef was the only flavour they still had in stock other than beef and tomato flavour. And beef and tomato flavour was a crime against humanity that was up there with guacamole flavoured tortilla chips and the sort of curry sauce that has raisins in it. Author's note. Unfortunately, the author speaks from real life experience on this matter. Anyhow, I feel like I talked about it a lot last year. But Doritos came out with a guacamole flavored Dorito, and it was a war crime. It was really awful. And usually, if like some sort of crisp taste pad, you can get over it. You can just put some salsa on there, put some cheese on it, some cheese sauce on there. No, no, everything made the taste worse, which I didn't know was possible. But now they don't exist, and they released a new pepperoni pizza flavor, which apparently people also don't like. I saw them reduced significantly recently, and that's usually a sign of this is awful. No one will eat it. Think of it now. Being so hungry probably had a big deal to do with how badly he'd been playing in all the games before the noodles had arrived. It wasn't that he'd suddenly lost everything that he'd gained at all. Yeah, System casually interrupted his thoughts about the fateful meeting between Dax and a cup of beef flavoured instant noodles. You weren't meant to die then. All Dax could say in response to this revelation was, oh? Download 45% complete, System informed him. It was probably going to take several days to download this upgrade at the rate at which things were currently progressing. I just further impressed on him how important better download speeds were going to be going forward. Increased affection from NPC, System chimed out, this time showing him a graphic of the God of War's affection level to him. Dax almost dropped the glass trinket box he had been admiring after picking it up off the vanity. This was so embarrassing. He felt like a character in an automata game right now, looking at the row of filled and unfilled hearts. To think that he had cried all over this man whilst covered in scratches and leaves from being in a bush when El Caldia probably had actual work business, work-related things. Where was I? To think that he had cried all over this man whilst covered in scratches and leaves from being in a bush when El Caldia probably had actual work business, work-related things he wanted to talk about. Hopefully Dax hadn't left any snot on his fancy work clothes. Or snod. Mini theatre. Is this Dethos's actual bedroom? System. Yes. Dax, where is it? System. In his palace? Dax, I get that, but where in the palace? System. It's like 3 rooms away from where you've been sleeping this whole time. Dax, and you didn't tell me? System. You didn't ask. The system is all about empowering customers' rights to agency and free choice. Dax, you have to promise me that there is a mini map upgrade. System. Dot dot dot. Dax, do you want to watch me flail around trying to find shit forever and not recognize that I'm already there? There was no response. End of chapter. Chapter 35. A concert of problems. It was a few days before Dax was able to meet the God of War again. He had spent that time ferrying his prayers from the prayer office to their prospective piles. Now that all the loose papers that had spilled out onto the floor during the 2 avalanches had been scooped up, He was faced with a dense mass of compressed papers that needed to be handled very delicately. You couldn't just grab a handful and pull them out. The paper was too thin and easily torn to be handled thusly. Dax had tried to induce small paper to fall out of the prayer room by walking heavily past it and even jumping up and down on the floorboards directly outside of it, but to no avail. He'd even overexerted himself so much with the jumping that he'd had to spend half an hour laying on the floor until he could assure himself that he wasn't going to pass out. Half of the papers he could see looked like just breathing on them would cause them to disintegrate. I should probably be wearing a pair of those white conservation gloves, Dax thought as he gently teased one out. Work that had previously taken him days already to complete grinded slowly to a halt. It had for a while filled Dax with a sense of purpose and pride that he was actually being useful, but using a dinner knife he'd found in a drawer to lever out the papers one by one whilst bending at a weird angle was frustrating. Frustrating and painful. He needed a break. When Dax had made the trek up the garden path to the front gate this morning to collect his breakfast, watched by all the guards loitering around there, he'd overheard them talking about a festival. What sort of festival it was, he had no idea, but hearing about it reawakened his wish to be anywhere and doing anything other than sorting through papers. For being in the heavenly realm for several weeks at this point, Dax's experience of the city could be boiled down to 3 rooms in the healing halls, the review from a carriage, a portion of his own home and garden, and an unknown amount of the Emperor's palace. Dax wanted to get out and see what the place was really like. He'd argued desperately to be able to go to the festival. He'd really wanted to go alone, and the guards, especially Ulrich, didn't want him to go at all, citing his health and how busy he must be. In the end, 2 unstoppable forces met 2 immovable objects, and instead of mutual destruction, things ended in a compromise. Dax could go, but Ulrich was going to escort him the entire time he was there. As much as Dax hated being babysat, it beat being the only person not able to attend the event. Once it was clear that he could go, the other guards were considerably happier to talk to him about the festival. Apparently, it was held every year in celebration of the heavenly in celebration of the heavenly emperor's ascension into the heavenly realm. So many heavenly. It's held in the heavenly city, in the heavenly realm, and it's the heavenly emperor's ascension by. Yellow peony flowers covered every street across the entire city, so bright that they could damage a mortal's sight. Any space not covered in the heavy blooms was instead festooned in vivid banners bearing his signature shell emblem. High above the buildings, rainbow-coloured kites filled the sky, somehow perfectly not tangling up with one another. The sky you could see in an animation, bright blue, a scattering of pure white fluffy clouds, and a round, bright yellow sun. Streets that had been empty when he had viewed it from the carriage on the way here were now packed. Stepping outside of the gate had felt more significant than Dax had imagined it would. Leaving the palace for the first time since arriving, crossing that imaginary wall and not knowing where their feet would take them or who they would meet. So far the people he had met had believed he was Dethos without too many questions. Taking this act out into the city without the upgrade from system that would display names for him was a big risk. It was also it was also it was a risk, however. It was a risk Dax, however, was determined to take because the unhelpful babysitting was getting to him. Dax and Ulrich walked down the street side by side, with Ulrich scanning the crowd carefully as they did so. Luckily, the Ulrich. Oh my god, this is another chapter that needs. Luckily, Ulrich hadn't demanded that they hold hands or link arms, but they were walking slightly too fast, and Dax found himself feeling hurried to keep up with them before they were lost in the crowd. It wasn't so busy that it was scary. He'd been to festivals before with his family and with friends, and sometimes the press of people ignited his fight or flight response. Several guards from the Emperor's palace were out there, guarding the crowd, controlling the flow of people through narrow spots, and ensuring the pace was sedate. Where Dax really wanted to go was the concert that was being held in a public square in the middle city. Ulrich had rolled their eyes and tried to divert his attention to a selection of highly decorated ceramic bowls on a stall in a narrow street lined with vendors. They were pretty and well made, but Dax had no interest in them, and the sheer amount of people that were trying to pass through the stalls made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. It didn't feel safe, and the place with the concert was more likely to have somewhere he could sit. Even though his strength had greatly increased, Dethos's body didn't react in the same way as his previous one had. Despite having lived in it for so long, there were still days where he went to do something and forgot just how much it was going to take out of him. The heavily sign The heavily signposted path to the concert venue was considerably wider, but it was still busy enough to get his feet stood on several times, and maneuvering their way through the crowd to get there. Dax got elbowed in the chest or face more than once. He was going to have some interesting bruises tomorrow. Remembering the golden colour of Dethos's blood, he wondered what colour they would end up being. As they made their way through the crowd, Dax began to notice the heads that were turning their way were increasing. It made sense. The wider city knew that Dethos was back, but until now very few people had actually seen him. Whispers started to filter through the crowd the longer he stayed in it, the louder they grew, and the wider they spread. He could hear the mumbling and had noticed the eyes that were on him, but he was determined to get to the concert being held by the deities of music. Who wouldn't want to experience that? Thank you for the follow. Welcome to the madness that is this book that I'm reading that I also wrote. And we're currently experiencing how many spelling problems I have. And just sentences that made no sense. I need to go back and edit. Today was probably not the best day to have his first trip out. When he really thought about it, a less overwhelming day would have been better, but Dax didn't have a lot of time to dwell on that as the crowd shifted. Dax found himself almost knocked off of his feet. He wobbled, trying to get his feet firmly planted back underneath him, legs that were already tired just from walking this far. Someone from out of the crowd reached out their arm and grabbed him at the elbow. Not expecting to be touched other than the normal jostling of a crowd, Dax jerked his arm away from their grip. When he looked up at the person the arm belonged to, expecting to see the face of Ulrich, annoyed that he drifted away from them, or a curious stranger, but it wasn't either. The arm belonged to the god of war, who was looking at him with a surprised expression on his face. He quickly withdrew his supporting hand. Dax leaned over to him, attempting to both apologize and thank him, but the crowd's whispering was now so loud that what he said was lost in the ambient noise. It was so loud that the gossiping parties could barely be considered to be whispering at all. The pushing around them grew increasingly out of hand as everyone fought to see this interaction between the god of war and the god of wheat, and the people around them shoved to see what was going on. The undulation of the crowd meant Dax was no longer able to control his direction of travel, quickly being swept away from where he was originally standing. He'd lost Ulrich at some point. When that had happened, he had no idea. Dax scanned the sea of faces around him, hoping to see Ulrich's face somewhere among them. Hoping to see them fighting their way towards him through the crush of people. They weren't there. Fear that had been sitting low in his stomach took this as its chance to leap up into his throat, its bony fingers wrapping themselves there. Dax wished he hadn't come out today. Another hand reached out of the mass of people and painfully grabbed his forearm. It wasn't Elgaldir. Dax could tell that immediately, and it wouldn't let go. Dax tried to wrench his arm away, but the other's grip was too tight. He could feel their manicured nails digging into his skin. There would definitely be bruises tomorrow. Pressing people on all sides, the noise of the crowd and the hand that just wouldn't let go were overwhelming. Dax put his hands over his ears and started screaming. At first he didn't realize that the scream was coming from his own mouth, and he wildly looked around, hoping that no one had fallen in the press of the crowd. Someone needed to help them. If they were on the floor, they could be easily trampled. People would fall over them, and that would lead to more people falling over and more trampling. Dax's thoughts were spiraling through half-remembered butterfly effect explanations, and he could feel himself shaking. He brought his free hand up to his mouth. His throat hurt, and found himself surprised by how open it was. Every contour of his face, Edward Monk's the scream, and every eye in the crowd on him. His heart hammered. He could no longer move under his own free will. All the muscles in his body were contracting, leaving him a statue trapped in bullet time. Where was Ulrich? Ulrich was meant to be his guard and keep him safe. He just wanted to go to the concert. A familiar, comforting smell passed by as something severed the connection between the unknown and unwanted arm and his body. The hand withdrew, but it was replaced by others that were not unwanted. Long fingernails scraped his arms as other hands returned, and these new hands tried to pull him into the depths of the crowd. Dax reached out to the smell, trusting in its feeling of familiarity, grabbing onto whoever was the source of it. His hands met a soft shirt and tightened around it desperately, like the material was a life ring. A cautious arm was placed in the middle of his back as Dax buried his face into the fabric, trying to block out some of the negative sensations he was experiencing. It held onto him loosely, like he could easily leave its protection at a moment's notice, but Dax could feel the muscle resting beneath the skin. There was no way the person the arm belonged to would let him be washed away. It acted like an anchor to a boat lost in a storm. They were buffeted by the crowd, but Dax felt safe in the knowledge that he was no longer at risk of capsizing. This small comfort helped him force his mind out of the tiny cave he had retreated to for safety. It surfaced to a staggering amount of noise that almost made him start screaming again. You shouldn't be anywhere near him after what you did to him, a voice screamed from the other end of one of the arms still pulling at Dax. There were outbursts of booing, and more arms reached to pull him away from his newly found friendly anchor. Dax turned to plead with whoever was steadying him to help him escape, and found the worried face of Elgaldia looking down at him. The scream was trying to force its way back out of his mouth again. Words that normally would be so easy to say stayed trapped in his throat, leaving Dax only able to grip the fabric in his hands tighter and look desperately towards the other god. His shoulder hurt. If this carried on much longer, it was going to dislocate. Visions of his arm being ripped right off of his body like a scene from some terrible horror movie intruded thoughts that should have been focused on getting the fuck out of here. Where was System when you actually needed it? His legs were aching, and he would have paid just to be able to safely sit in the road. Something wet was sliding down his face, and he looked up expecting there to be rain clouds overhead, spilling their watery burden on him too. It would be thematic for it to start pouring right now. Ow. Great thunderclaps rending the air, jagged lightning flashing and endless sheets of rain drenching him, making him look as miserable and heart-wrenching as an abandoned puppy. Dax was saved from becoming such a thematically pitiful sight, though, because the wet sensation on his face was just his own tears. He was tired, he was in pain, and most of all right now, he was angry. Why did so many random people feel like they just had to parent him? He was capable of making his own decisions about his life. Right now he might be struggling to remain standing because he literally hadn't stood this long since waking up. Not all in one go, at least. That, however, didn't mean that they got to decide things for him, especially not when he hadn't been told why Dethos apparently couldn't be seen with the god of war. Heck, even if there was a good reason for it, hanging out with Elgaldia was up to him to decide to do or not do. And where the fuck is Ulrich, who was meant to be keeping me safe, he thought, peeping back at the crowd from beneath the shirt he was wrinkling the fuck out of. Dax was finally snapped out of his internal ranting by the realization that his toes were tingling and wheat was growing out of the gaps in the paving blocks beneath his feet. It sprouted, grew, and ripened before the grain fell, and the cycle began again. Each loop of the wheat's birth, life, and death increased in speed until it was nothing but a blur. He closed his eyes and tried to calm down enough to be able to talk again. Losing all control of Dethos's body in public didn't seem like a great idea, especially when he didn't have any idea the extent of what it was capable of doing. Going for people's throats was a very tempting idea, though right now is some opportunistic. Going for people's throats was a very tempting idea, though right now, as some opportunistic pervert pinched his ass. Make note to kill them, he thought. Memo note. Memo note. Make note to kill them has been recorded, the system cheerily replied. Dax just looked up at Oh, my reading skill really out the window right now. Dax just looked up at Elgaldia, a god whose face grew increasingly distressed. But he too seemed to be locked in place. Dax wished the larger god would pull the two of them out of there to somewhere quiet, and most importantly, somewhere safe. The sudden arrival of Mother Willow and a large number of pretty beefy-looking guards changed everything. She was calm, her voice commanding, and the crowd parted before her in deference. Everyone put your hands on your head and take 2 steps backwards. It might be a command given to school-aged humans, and from anyone else, such direction would have started a fight, but this was Mother Willow. You did whatever Mother Willow told you to do. To her, everyone here was a child. The crowd rustled and bustled. It clinked and it clanked as everyone tried to follow her instruction whilst not stepping on anyone else's toes. Drawing further ire from Mother Willow right now might end your life as a deity of the heavenly realm, rather abruptly. Yes, that does mean you, Abusius Crispus. You may be the deity of fried foods, but it's you that will be fried if you don't take your hands off of Dethos before I count to 3. Mother Willow scolded, grabbing the back of his collared shirt and dragging him away from Dax. She was a willow spirit second. Always, always a mother first, who couldn't stand seeing someone scared. What could the crowd do but comply with what she was asking? Every one of them, even Crispus, with a reputation as the brightest rule breaker outside of the underworld, did what he was told, in fear of wrinkling his favourite chicken nugget shirt. People said his bad behaviour came from the heat of the frying oil. Crispus and their believers would have you know that they were in fact highly misunderstood because of translation errors caused by ketchup and grease stains. Thank you very much. Come with me, my dear, Mother Willow said, reaching out her hands to Dax and glaring at everyone who was still standing within 15 feet of him until they backed up enough to her liking. The guards started forcing people to disperse in small groups to prevent any more dangerous things from happening. They left in 6s and 8s before Dax finally felt that he could breathe again. As no one seems to have any manners or decorum, she turned to address the leaving crowd. You should all be ashamed. Then she turned once more to look at Algaldir, who was still standing stock still, holding onto Dax's arm. He was still as stiff and unresponsive as Dax was. Thank you for at least trying to help, Mother Willow said as she gently took his free hand, pulling the two of them behind her, like a mother trying to get her children to leave the toy aisle of a supermarket. Her touch didn't scare Dax the way the crowds had, and with the still potent feelings of safety that Elgaldi's anchor-like behaviour had given him, he followed without putting up much of a fuss. He was having decisions made for him again, and though he wasn't happy about it, he was grateful that she had gotten him out of the unsafe situation before. Elgaldia also didn't resist being pulled along, and that helped Dax bolster his confidence that this wasn't going to be a bad thing. The 3 of them walked together, Mother Willow pulling both of them behind her as Dax still clutched onto the fabric of the war god's shirt. Ducks, they were just little ducks. As they walked, the crowd, which had so easily pushed in on him from every side and tried to consume him, parted like stalks of grain in the breeze. Despite the presence of Mother Willow, Dax could hear the murmurs behind them. Not loud enough to hear what they were saying, but certainly loud enough to know residents of the heavenly realm weren't above gossip. That didn't help with his worry about playing the part of Dethos. If things were going to be like this every time he left the house, there was no way he was ever going to get anything done. It wasn't long before Mother Willow had guided the two into her personal gardens. The muscles in his legs were cramping, and Dax was grateful the destination wasn't any further away. Or he might have to get down on his knees, on his hands and knees, crawling on the stone flagstones in order to make it through the gate. He looked apologetically at them both whilst sitting himself down on a protruding moss-covered root. His legs were shaking so much that it was hard to sit up, and Dax had to use his hands to steady himself until the tremors gave way. If he hadn't sat down right there and then, Dax was pretty sure he would have passed out. Dax was very over passing out at the moment. At this point, if you don't know, at this point in the story, he's passed out about 4 times. It was very plot convenient. I feel like that happened. The forest was oddly silent. Leaf rustles seemed muffled, as if he was hearing them come from another room at a party, but that was probably the muscle pain drowning out the sound. It was hard to listen to anything when it felt like someone was trying to rip the muscles out of his legs. Dax had never been so aware of his. Oh my god, I wrote this and never thought about having to say it. Gastrocnemius? 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 And vastus medialis. We're going to go with gastrocnemius and vastus medialis. Or medialis? Medialis? We don't know. This is where not doing Latin means to get me. He never had to worry about those muscles in his entire life. His shirt that he had happily pulled out of the wardrobe that morning was now badly stretched around the neck and armholes. Dax attempted to straighten his clothes, uncomfortable with just how much chest he was showing. Deities was covered with scars, and no one here had the self-restraint not to stare at him. Algaldia was very pointedly looking only at his face, and Dax could tell he was uncomfortable, but whether that was just how easy it would be to have a nip slip right now, or with the bright red lines crisscrossing his torso, he couldn't tell. From somewhere in the distance, he could faintly hear the sound of the concert he had been so excited to attend this morning. Dax cursed under his breath. He was going to miss it now. Mother Willow and Elgaldia sat down beside him on the grass a little more gracefully than he had flopped down onto it. Wheat was still growing, where his feet made contact with the soil. Somewhere along the way, Dax had lost his shoes, and he was only just now realizing that he was barefoot. Before long, all three of them were surrounded by a miniature-sized field of green wheat. They sat there in silence, with the only sound there being that of willow leaves rustling in the wind, until Dax managed to find his voice once more. Well, that was just more than I thought it would be, he said. His legs were shaking still, partly from today's exertion, partly from the adrenaline still pumping around his body. Mother Willow passed him a large soft fruit he didn't recognize, and Dax bit into it instantly. He hadn't realized just how hungry he was until the sugar from it hit his tongue. Deities here can be a lot to deal with, especially when they get overly excited, Mother Willow said, handing him another fruit from a Hessian bag. Overly excited was certainly one way of describing what was happening. Frenzied mob was another. Frenzied mob was more how Dax would have expressed it. You've been through a lot, Mother Willow said as she handed to the still silent Elgaldia one of the fruits from her bag. Yeah, the whole dying, not dying thing was a lot. Dax corrected himself halfway through the sentence and hoped it wasn't too noticeable. The goddess stood up, beckoning Dax to follow her as Elgaldia sat slowly chewing on the fruit he had just been given. Each of his steps left little islands of wheat amongst the bark-filled path between the towering willow trees. When they were out of earshot of the god of war and sat on a very ornately carved wooden bench, Mother Willow turned to him and gave him a very searching look before saying something that put every single one of the hairs on his body on end. He didn't have goosebumps, he was simply one giant goosebump. Eating that ramen was a really bad idea, but you're here now, and that's what matters. The ancient goddess leaned over and picked an errant leaf from his hair before gently blowing it off with her open palm. What once was a yellow leaf was now pollen dissipating into the wind around them. Dax blinked. He blinked a good 45 times in shock as to what he was even experiencing. Then he sneezed. The pollen that had up until mere moments ago been a leaf was still hanging in the air. His brain was still attempting to take in what she had just said. System appeared again. This time its light pulsating in an ominous red that really wasn't helping with the emotional state of his upheaval. There'll be more time to talk about this later, she said, as if she had read his mind. For now, though, I'm sure you have some rather pressing questions about why people thought dragging you whilst you screamed for help away from Elgaldia was a good decision. Desperate to turn the conversation away from anything that might cause the system to end this second life prematurely, Dax nodded. Surviving was his number one priority right now. He looked at once, who knew whether there would be a second time. He was also extremely curious about what had actually happened for the others to behave so frenziedly. I had noticed there was a tension before, and he had told me himself that he did something bad, Dax said, fiddling with the hem of his sleeve. But this degree of animosity is surprising. Mother Willow reached out to him, gently placing her hands on either side of his face. Her gaze was unwaveringly serious, but Dax could also see the sorrow she openly wore, a deep sadness. He killed you. He killed you during the battle of Windblown Tears. Dax was confused. It was a battle, though. Accidents happen on a battlefield. He could feel the fear that had been behind the screams earlier creeping up into his throat again. He'd been hanging out with the person who had killed him. No, who had killed Dethos? You're Dax Moonfield, the guy that died because of a weird cosmic coincidence and being bad at judging how hot liquids are. Dax Moonfield, who's somehow ended up piloting someone else's body like a flesh mech, he told himself furiously. He'd fallen asleep on Elgaldia and been tucked into bed tenderly by him. Try as he might, Dax couldn't meld the two pictures in his head. I'm the god of wheat. Why would I be on the battlefield? What purpose did a cereal god have enough of to cause the god of war to kill him? A warm hand stroked his back. Mother Willow's attempt at comforting him keyed him in that she was steeling herself to say something that was going to be very hard for him to hear. Fate seemed to be drawing Elgaldi and him together once more, despite everything that was attempting to permanently part them. Even now, as he was being told of what had befallen them both, Dax could still feel himself being pulled towards the god of war. Maybe his sheer size gave him a gravitational pull Dax couldn't break away from. You were protecting the temple. Her tone was flat. The effect of a doctor who had come to tell you that actually this illness was serious and it might kill you. A building that's not important enough to die for, Dax almost scoffed in momentary relief. The humans were trying to shelter there, Mother Willow pressed on. She still had her hands on either side of his face, but they were soon re-employed, rubbing his back, attempting to soothe him. The true horror of her statement, the true horror of the events, slowly overcame Dax's reason. Or what little reason he had left. Dax was screaming again, not from fear this time, but because of the memories now rolling before his eyes. He screamed till he felt hoarse. He screamed till it felt like there was no air left in the world, till it felt like his throat was bleeding, until he was choking, until he didn't have the energy to keep going, and all that left his mouth was raspy sounding keening. All Mother Willow and Elgaldi could do was watch over him as he did so, for he couldn't be touched. Every time they moved to soothe him, the wheat stalk grew higher and thicker, preventing them from doing so. Tears fell from both their eyes. All they could do was wait. Minithia. Dax, how many times are you going to make me scream in one chapter? Arthur, as many as I like. This chapter was so difficult and so much effort to edit. There was a day where I had it open for 18 hours and just watched YouTube videos about tie-dyeing. Dax, you better get me ice cream for this. End of chapter. This one was a really long chapter. I think in the book there is 3 or 4 chapters that are over 5k words, and this is one of them. Writing it. I don't think writing it, but when editing it, that was truly hell. I also love how I edited all of these chapters at least 3 times. Still spelling problems. Normally you would get a better reader at that point, but you know, this is just me doing it. Chapter 36. The Archaeologists Descend. It had been some time since the farmer had run to tell people of the beautiful stone he had found in his field. As a farmer in a place where it was almost impossible to farm, the nearest neighbours weren't close. Plus he'd gone there on foot and wasn't a young man anymore. The donkey he had owned with his family had died during the winter. There was only an ox in the barn now, an ox he couldn't risk taking on this journey because he would need it to be in peak condition once the ploughing started. After 2 days of walking on the steep mountain paths and broken roads, his feet were beginning to make him feel like that may have been a stupid idea. His feet would probably never be the same again. It felt like his entire foot was one single blister, and it damaged his pride as a farmer, that he was in any pain at all. Deep down in his bones, he knew that this was a journey that he needed to take. It was like destiny had taken his hand and was pulling him alongside it. His grandmother had always said that they had stayed farming on that mountain for a reason. That reason had never been explained throughout the long years of her life, and here he was finding something that felt desperately important. All it had taken was his spade and the need to follow the old farming traditions. Maybe this was the reason. Maybe this was his reason. Grandmother had always said that everyone was put in the world for a reason. Grandmother had said a lot of things. Out on the plain, he reached the first small house built from mud brick and turf to keep out of the wind and the freezing winds in winter. It was here he had spoken the first news about the marvelous stone, asking for directions to a large town with someone who would know what to do. Word spread throughout the region, moving from hamlet to village, town to town, just as he did. Eventually, it reached the nearest sea and drew the interest of some archaeologists. Piles of books and papers littered the floor of their office as they searched for any mention of a structure in the vicinity of where the stone had been found. Diligent students rifled through library shelves that hadn't seen a single human in decades, thick with dust and the scent of aged paper. Hundreds of obscure texts and maps scoured is what I was trying to say, scoured, for even the faintest hint of any kind of construction using this kind of stone, but despite this, they found nothing. If there had been a building, there wasn't anything among their written documents that recorded it. That wasn't to say that there hadn't ever been something. Plenty of documents were lost to history. Floods, fires, a desperate need for loo roll during an epidemic of some diarrhea-causing sickness. There were many reasons written records were lost. This paragraph was inspired by COVID, when everyone was going crazy for loo roll. I think it's like one of the earliest chapters I wrote, and it just ended up being this late in the story later on when I rearranged a lot of the chapters. If the farmer who had found the stone was correct in his description of it, the highly decorative masonry was a first for the area. In the archaeologist's experiences, circumstances thus pointed to this being a stone meant for some temple or municipal building down in the plains. People in the plains lived in small clusters of settlements around the winding rivers and lakes dotted across it. Barely anyone lived in the mountains. The road down from them to the larger settlements was bumpy. It always had been. Not hard to lose a few stones with how much it would jostle a cart. Even now, people lost things on the challenging roads. The stone itself was interesting enough to send a team to go look at it in situ, but the increasing possibility that this might be a genuinely unknown discovery was scintillating. Discovering something like this had the potential to make someone's entire career. The search for answers and the absolute wonder at finding something under the earth that hadn't been seen before in living memory was what an archaeologist lived for. They packed up equipment and supplies, heading out to find this important stone and the secrets it was hiding, tracking the news back the way it had come from city to town to village, eventually to the farm where it lay mostly covered in dirt. Every town and village that they stopped in along the way was filled with curious locals who wanted to know why they had come from the city, and filled with stories that they were desperate to tell about the stone. But no one had any actual information about the origins of the stone. There wasn't even any folk stories, even in the settlements closest to the mountain, in the field it was sitting in. They talked to elders everywhere and leafed through local documents, but there wasn't even a vague mention of anything that the stone could have belonged to. Still, everyone they met had a theory about its origin and meaning. The archaeologists resigned themselves to having to go see the stone and see if the patterning and colour were anything like other known buildings. Hey, Brooke, how you doing? I haven't seen you in what feels like 1,000 years. It's nice to see you, though. I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a nice Christmas and a nice New Year. Oh, my toe just clicked. And if you didn't, well, I hope 2024 is better. Uh, we're in, we're like about halfway done with this stream. I think we're in chapter 35. My bonk, I don't remember. My brain is, I'm very tired right now. My brain just like wipes everything. When I'm tired, I'm just like, What was the sentence I just said? Na, 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 na. So the archaeologists resigned themselves to having to go see the stone and see if the patterning and colour were anything like other known buildings in the area it might have been made for. There were also rumours that there was writing on the stone. If that was true, it would be incredibly helpful to determine where and when it was from. The group of archaeologists were brought to see the oldest member of the last village before they had to start their ascent into the mountains. He was the oldest man any of them had ever seen. Someone so old you were constantly marveling how they were still alive. Someone that made you constantly anxious that they could pass away at any given moment, which made what he was about to tell them all the more vital to document, for it would soon be lost forever. As they sat in his house, all crammed in together around a kitchen table that took up 80% of the room, he told them the tale once told to him by his own great-grandmother. The man was almost entirely deaf and dealing with significant hearing loss caused by his advanced age, so the details of the story took some time to figure out. According to this now long-dead great-grandmother, once upon a time there had been a beautiful temple on the side of the mountain, all built from carved and carefully polished white stone that wasn't found occurring naturally in 100 miles of the place the stone had been found lying in a field. An entire temple built out of it would have taken decades to build, and a mind-boggling amount of both money and manpower to hew, form, transport, and erect. There had been more people living in the valley then. The worn cobbled roads filled with grass and small thorn bushes that laced the plateau, valley, and mountains had been properly paved back then. People had followed them, climbing up the many steps on the side of Mount. This is another word I wrote without thinking about how to pronounce it. We're going to go with Deitsia. Mount Deitsia, laden with offerings to the temple, praying for good harvests, not to a mountain god that much the old man was sure, but to someone who would watch over the fields. Young people had completed the climb, kneeling in the temple, praying for a lover, a life partner, a child. If you had problems with your bread, his great-grandma had told him, you went to the temple and threw the offering loaf into the ritual fire, and the deity that lived there would help you make a better one next time. People in the village still burned bread like this when there was a problem, but only a slice. Grain was too precious a thing to waste. It had once grown abundantly in the mountains and increasingly copiously out on the plains, but they could barely grow enough to eat themselves. In recent years, many fields had grown entirely barren. In both growing and burning, the results were unpredictable now. Who this helpful deity was long lost to history. Local belief had dwindled to only its most vestigial traditions since the day the mountain collapsed. It was these things that you did because your parents did them, and it didn't hurt to continue doing them because they reminded you of your family that had been helping to keep someone alive. The temple had apparently been lost under the landslide from the mountain, caused by a fight among the gods and demons that had made the earth tremble, or so the story passed down from family member to family member had said. This tale was the first clue that maybe there was more than just this one singular stone. Maybe it was more than just a stone falling out of a wagon. A forgotten temple find would be a massive event. A temple lost in an earthquake was a find even rarer than being able to pick a needle out of a haystack. There was going to be so much information stored under the ground, waiting for them to recover. Or uncover. Whichever. Where am I? It boosted their energy and determination to reach the stone. Now they had a real balance in their collective step that carried them over the steep mountain. Definitely catch up. Definitely. It boosted their energy and determination to reach the stone. Now they had a real bounce in their collective step that carried them over the steep mountain pass and down into the valley below. There they met the farmer who had originally reported the find, with his permission, set up several tents in a fallow field. After a short rest, they were all gathered looking at the stone they'd heard so much about, where it lay in the ploughed field now filled with germinating wheat. The archaeologists stood around it, brandishing almost every tool of their profession, ready to record whatever they could. It was just as beautiful as the community whispers had said. This first stone was likely the first of many, many more, if there truly was a temple here, hidden beneath the soil. With intricate carvings and still somehow polished edges, it truly was a remarkable stone. Not a single crack or scuff on its surface, the flowers somehow survived completely intact. To the casual observer, it looked like someone had come along and buried a freshly cut stone in the ground, and then made a fuss about it to draw attention. It was the writing carved onto its surface that had proved this was something much older. It was 3 weeks into their archaeological investigation when trowels and brushes actually met the dirt, and they began digging. Not long after that, they found the first bone. The first human bone. Ooh, spooky. Mini theatre. Farmer. It's not a big city hotel like what I'm sure you're used to, but it's got no big rocks in it. Archaeology. Archaeological leader. Thank you for letting us stay in your field. Farmer leaves. Archaeologist leader. No big rocks, you say. Picks up a pretty large looking rock. I'd hate to see what he considered to be a rock. Author's note. Just know that every time I wrote archaeologist in this chapter, I wrote architect first by accident, and I had to go back and change it. Cries forever. I really did. It was it was hell. I realized I can't spell archaeologist either, so every time I wrote archaeologist, I wrote architect first, and I corrected it to archaeologist, and I had to correct the spelling of archaeologist. Truly, the true struggle. The struggle is real. Truly real. Truly. Chapter 37. But what really happened? Rather than an aesthetic movie filled with half music and soft pink lighting, the memories rushing behind his eyes were a compilation of short clips spliced with a slideshow of images set to badly recorded audio. Dax was drowning in memories that weren't his, and all it had taken was a single conversation with Mother Willow. They bombarded his senses, random in order to the point it made him feel nauseous, trying to make any sense of what was going on. From what Dax actually could understand from the little glimpses, these memories were from the fateful day she'd mentioned earlier. There was nothing about how that day ended contained within the soup of recollection. You're welcome. But I hope the homework goes well. It's about to get gory. um, I think I can't remember. One of the chapters that I left to read gets gory. Or that might be in the 50s, like the ones that haven't been posted online yet. I don't know, I can't remember where in the story. Because I'm editing chapters in the 50s to make them readable. And what's real scary is the chapters in the 60s that I haven't touched since 2022. And I open it, and there's a chapter that has 28 words in it. And I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm doing with this. I'm glad it's helping you in somewhere or just distracting. Now I forgot where I was. Yeah, we didn't see how it ended. Yes. I would think being killed would be particularly memorable. He certainly remembered his own death very vividly. Electrocution was really not something to joke about. Even if it had been a very meme-worthy way to go, no doubt there would be many videos made telling the tale of how stupid he has been. Mother Willow had told Dax Elgaldia had been the one who killed Dethos, but in what memory Dax had access to, there was no sign of him. All around him were the scared faces of humans standing in his temple as the ground shook beneath them. The ceiling was tall, and decorations hanging from the ceiling swung crazily, threatening to fall down onto them all. A temple fire was burning, and he could taste the smoke from it on his tongue. Somehow Jax knew that this scene was the end of the sequence, despite how jumbled up everything was. They were watching him walk out of the main temple door before it shut behind him, and it was bolted closed. Not an act of abandonment on his part, but a move clearly made to defend them. The god of wheat may not be a martial god, but he wasn't without power, here in his holy place, in the land where he had been born among the golden stalks of wheat. It was a last-ditch attempt from Dethos to keep the humans safe. Dax had felt their trust in him, their fear, and Dethos's desperate anger as he stepped through the temple door threshold. There had to be prayers from those that had sheltered in the temple that day, still lying in the prayer office. Somewhere with the mountain of paper, their terrified pleas were waiting to be found. 4,000 years had passed since then. It would be a miracle if they hadn't all disintegrated, left behind only as fragments of the faith his believers had entrusted to him. Elgaldi had offered to walk him home once Dax had regained control of his body once more and knew when he was, ignorant to the revelation bestowed on the god of wheat. Dax had politely declined, and the god of war had taken his rejection gracefully. He looked at Elgaldia, the man was so nice to him. Just being around him made Dax feel like he wasn't going to go insane cooped up here. He was someone that didn't treat him like an antique porcelain doll that they placed on a shelf and never played with. Sure, he hadn't reacted in the way Dax would have preferred during the crowded situation earlier, but he hadn't actually communicated what that was to him. It was rather nice for someone in the heavenly realm to wait to see what actions he would choose to make first, to trust in his ability to make his own choices, while barreling in and making them for him. Right now, he was used to not getting any real say on what happened in his life other than dealing with the prayers. Another spelling problem. Prayers which he guessed Ulrus and the guards couldn't actually do anything about. Elgaldi just being there and holding on to him so he wouldn't be swept away into the crowd had helped him not completely lose it in public, which was good, though some people might say bawling your eyes out and screaming at the top of your lungs like you were actually being murdered wasn't being that in control of yourself. Dax begged to differ on that because he hadn't turned anyone into wheat or started punching everything and everyone within punching distance like his terrified mind had wanted him to. Now, looking back on the situation, Dax was able to see that others' reluctance to touch him. his gentle but firm hold, and how his face had been angrily looking at the deities touching him without his consent. Their hands had been on his bare skin. Elgaldia's hands had been on top of his clothing. He hadn't been able to thank him for what he had done yet, or apologize for the screaming, which seemed to have been what made him freeze and unable to act any further. Reconciling this guy, the guy that had spent so much time talking him out of a thorn bush, and who smiled so brightly when he had left that bush, with scratches all over him, with the image of him as his killer. Try as he might, Dax couldn't do it. He couldn't see Elgaldia killing anyone without a good reason. That didn't mean a murderer couldn't hide behind a pleasant affect, a handsome face, and some good deeds, but something in his gut was telling Dax that he wasn't getting the full picture. Very obviously, he didn't even possess the entirety of the memory from Dethos's perspective. There was no one here he trusted to give him a full and accurate account of what had actually happened. Everyone had some agenda, even Elgaldia, and he had no idea what he was going to do about Mother Willow apparently just being able to see into his soul or something. The only way he could maybe learn more of the details was through those unanswered prayers stacked on every available surface in the palace. Surely they would have something to say about his death. People had probably witnessed it. From the temple, maybe they'd seen it happen. Maybe people in the surrounding area were filled with tales of the Battle of Windblown Tears, and he could try to find out via folk tales what had actually happened, lining up all the places they overlapped and assembling the truth. After declining Elgaldia's offer of an escort home, Dax had used every ounce of remaining muscle strength to get back to his palace, legs burning with every step he took back up the hill that he was starting to hate with a vengeance. If coming down had been overexerting, then going up was demanding in a way his body just couldn't pay. From his position prone in the gravel of the courtyard, neatly concealed by various foliage, Dax thought that maybe leaving had been a stupid thing to do. Not for the first time today. His legs wouldn't stop shaking as he ate barley sugar twists from a bag one of the guards had given him. Eating sweets given to you by a stranger was one of the first things you were taught not to do as a child, but the only way to stop them from carrying him into the palace on their backs was to agree to eat some festival sweets. Someone had told them to get a selection of delicacies only available at this time of year, like they knew he wasn't going to be able to see them for himself this year otherwise. He could have and should have accepted the guard's help getting to bed, but there was something about being put to bed in the early afternoon by one's assigned door guard that rubbed him the wrong way. Nothing wrong with laying in your own gravel. It was perfectly good gravel. Gravel that would leave Dax covered in lumps and bumps from its uneven texture that would take a long time to flatten out. Getting back up off the floor was a task that was easier to think about than to do. Dax made it happen through sheer determination and the ability to ignore his own pain. You'd think that as an immortal, you wouldn't have to deal with deliberate, delib- debilitating, debilitating leg cramps. Being a divine immortal being didn't seem to have as many benefits as you would expect it to, although he was considerably weaker than just about everyone here right now. It took 2 days for Dax to recover enough to slip out of Ulris's renewed interest in being a watchful guardian once more. Getting separated in the crowd wasn't something Dax was going to hold against them. They were beating themselves up about it enough already, plus accidents happened. Although he had started suspecting just how much anyone was actually attempting to guard him in the first place. When he was finally able to escape, Ulris following his every move, Dax was finally able to head back to the sheer organized chaos that was the prayer organization process. Mountain of paper, more like a mountain range of paper, he thought, staring in there once more. Any other day he would have thought, let's do this tomorrow. But if any of the prayers from potential witnesses were still in the prayer office, then they were extremely time sensitive. Prayer could only last as long as it could be fulfilled, after all. He dedicated every waking moment, apart from getting food, to extracting and sifting through the prayers still left in the densely compacted wall-like mound in the office. Dax also realized that he needed to recheck all of the piles he had made before to ensure nothing would be accidentally overlooked. It was going to take hundreds, if not thousands, of hours to complete. Mother Willow had said that he had tried to save them. A very heavy stress had been placed on that tried. Mother Willow had said that he had tried to save them. A very heavy stress had been placed on the tried, which could only mean that he had been unsuccessful at it. His mind drifted back to the memory of all those scared but trusting eyes watching him leave, and Dax threw himself back into combing through the prayers for any clue that he could gather. Looking at the paper had been overwhelming before when he had been directionless, when there's literally thousands of starting points sitting before you. Picking one is very hard. This task had fallen into his lap with the highest of priorities. Those souls had needed him then, and now there was a possibility that he could still help them. A small god could do a lot if they really wanted to. Getting there just took determination and the knowledge of how to actually fulfill these things. Right now, he wasn't strong enough to go down to the human realm on his own. To be honest, system wasn't willing to tell him how to do it either. It seemed like he was well and truly fucked in that regard. His god strength wasn't strong enough, and the only way you increased it was to gain believers and fulfill prayers. Luckily, he had more than enough prayers to fulfill. Right now, he was up to his waist in prayer papers, wandering up and down the room where he had previously been neatly storing sorted stacks of prayer. Ordering that had been delicately done, resulting in very specific categories, was now reverted back into a scattered mess. Despite his attempts to not step on any of the prayers, every footstep caused a crinkle noise, not unlike stepping on piles of autumnal leaves. Walking back and forth between the two rooms' doorways, Dax looked for a solution. There had to be a way. An idea hit him just like a bolt from the blue. If the only way to get down to the human realm was to gain the strength to do so via fulfilling prayers whilst remaining in the heavenly realm, then of course he had to pay a visit to his number one believer. Luckily, he knew exactly who that person was, and they were here in the heavenly city at this very exact moment. Someone who had prayed over 1,000,000 times to keep his body alive would surely be willing to help him out now. The only problem was that they had increased his security detail, and where before there had only been 2 guards at the front gate, now there were 5. 5. All day and all night, 5 guards stood at the door, not to mention the ones scattered through the grounds and potentially hidden within the palace. It was time to sneak out again. Mini theatre. Dax, face down in gravel, sucking on a boiled sweet. Guard 1. What do we do? Guard 2. We leave him. Guard 3. Is this normal? Guard 2. Pretty much. Guard 5. Pokes Dax. Dax groans in discomfort. End of chapter. Chapter 38. Unexpected Visit. For the first time in a while, the God of War found himself in his own office within the War Department's administrative building, actually doing his paperwork. Sure, Ilgaldia came and sat in here for at least an hour every day when he wasn't needed elsewhere, but he'd never really gotten used to the amount of clerical work that needed to be done here. His previous position had paperwork, of course, but it had been such higher stakes, cross-referencing things, fact-checking, and ensuring both parties talked to one another civilly. Here there was a lot of ticking boxes on multi-page, multiple-choice questionnaires. Everyone kept walking past his door and peeping, and then questioning the staff that were taking papers in and out of it about what was going on. It was very lucky that things in the human world were pretty peaceful right now, so there weren't that many prayers crossing his desk. What prayers had come in were the result of relatively minor border skirmishes in the northwest, which could be easily handled by his juniors. Despite that, there wasn't anyone that could take on the administrative duties of the God of War, and the pile had only grown larger in his absence. There was no rest for those who were behind on their paperwork, unless they wanted to drown in it. Office work wasn't the most glamorous part of being a god, and no one warned you about that. It snuck up on you like a curse, where the more you filled out, the more spawned, leaving you trapped in an endless loop of opening envelopes and resealing them, a Mobius strip of paper-based suffering. It felt truly pointless, but he wasn't the only one working today. The whole office was filled with people. The war department was a popular place to work, and there was always enough work to go around. Unlike the seasonal work of the botanical deities and the festival spirits, the war department only competed with the deities of death for the highest amount of overtime hours. Elgaldia was slowly losing steam, taking longer and longer to fill out or sign the things placed on the desk in front of him. The initial flurry of work slowed to a trickle as his mind began to wander. He'd been so happy to come in today, to distract himself from yesterday. Everyone had the day off to attend the festival. He'd personally gone out to give his present to Venus and collected some sweets for Dethos. He knew that the god of wheat had not left his palace except to visit the emperor's palace yet, so would likely miss the festival. He still needed to eat, so the gesture didn't seem too intimate, and Elgaldia knew that knew what he liked to eat. Gathering his favourite treats wasn't hard work, and any chance to do something nice for the other god was a blessing. Seeing Dethos amidst the crush of the crowd had been shocking. His face bobbed among the mass of people in a way that made Elgaldia unable to see anyone else. He could still now, several weeks on from the wheat god's reappearance, barely believe that he had been right all this time, and Dethos was still alive. It had taken him longer than he should it had taken him longer than it should have to notice the distress on that face and the shift in the crowd's sentiment, hands grabbing at his arms and clothes. He wasn't strong enough right now to remove. Everyone's lack of respect towards a fellow citizen who very obviously didn't want to be touched both enraged him. Elgaldia should have pulled him out immediately. Dethos was both physically and magically weaker now than before. Despite knowing how fiercely independent he was and not wanting the weak god to feel any more disrespected, Elgaldia should have not hesitated so much. His hesitation had only led to the other's increasing distress. Nothing could have prepared him for Dethos's screaming. He'd been prepared to be punched for touching him, publicly condemned for touching him, but none of that would have mattered if Dethos was safe. His screams took Elgaldia back to a place he never wanted to be in again. Holding on to Dethos, feeling the warmth of his arm through the fabric of his sleeve kept him somewhat anchored in the present. Dethos's warmth was proof that he was still alive. That Elgaldia's sins weren't absolute. He'd been unable to do anything, frozen there, holding on to him, locked in the fear he was hurting him, that he was making the situation worse. Before he knew it, Elgaldia was back there, the night he killed Dethos. Blood. So much blood. A piercing scream and a look of betrayal in the eyes that had only ever looked at him with love. So here he was, forcing himself to do paperwork, to not think about his failure, sitting at a desk with his view now almost entirely obstructed by large piles of paper, haphazardly stacked one on top of the other. It looked like even the smallest of breezes would cause the whole thing to collapse. Elgaldia half wished that it would do so, if only so that he would be able to get up out of his seat and have something other to do than dip a quill into ink and agree to let the nation of Velocipen develop a better crossbow, one that didn't take 3 people to load. He was going to summon what remained of his will to start working again so he didn't dwell on the negative thoughts swirling around his brain. In the silence of his room, Elgaldia could hear the chatter of his juniors through the partially open door, which led into a corridor, and then into a communal office space. He couldn't hear exactly what was being said, just the odd word now and then, as the doors behind them opened and closed, but it was calming. Their voices reminded him that he wasn't alone. The friendly chattering suddenly quietened, and the moment someone walked in through the front door, Elgaldia could hear the squeaking of its hinges and wrote a reminder to ensure that they were oiled again. The juniors who had happily been working away on the piles of documents that didn't need to be passed on to Elgaldia stopped moving, standing, or sitting frozen in their positions as the visitor opened the door. Weapons, writing instruments, and papers held in loose hands fell to the floor, clattering against its surface. Sure, everyone knew that he was back. Literally everyone knew that. You had to have been living under a rock, especially after the events of yesterday, not to know. Everyone also knew that the boss had almost gotten into a street brawl over him yesterday. There were very few members that had ever met Dethos, but they all knew what had happened in the Battle of Windblown Tears. All of that meant the God of Wheat standing in the doorway of the War Department's administrative office was intensely shocking. The unwritten rule in this place of work was not to mention Dethos, ever. Not at all. It had been something that had been passed down by seniors who had actually experienced the emotional fallout caused by Dethos's death, and knew just how much thinking about the battle distressed Ilgaldia. It was, however, hard to do so, with him standing right there in the doorway, tentatively holding onto the door frame with one hand, and the other still propping open the heavy door. He looked unsure as to whether someone was going to come running at him, shouting that he wasn't allowed to be in there at any moment, shooing him outside before he was able to do what he had come here for. That didn't happen. Naiwes was the first to move, scrambling his way into Ilgaldi's office to inform him of their very unexpected visitor. A tiled floor was very practical, but not great to be running on in Sabatons, and he had only just loosened. A tiled floor was very practical, but not great to be running on in Sabatons that he had only just loosened for comfort, intending to take off after finishing his report on a new form of explosive. Unfortunately, Naiwes had built up so much momentum running that he couldn't slow down enough not to slip and slam into the door with his full body weight. Elgaldia jumped at the sound of someone body slamming his office door. He rushed out from the paperwork mountain he was sequestered behind, causing the papers to slide onto the floor behind him. It was going to be a nightmare to deal with later, but at least it would be a diverting nightmare. As he opened the office door, there was a resounding number of clanks and clunks as Naiwes fell into the room itself. Elgaldia raised an eyebrow at him in query. Naiwes looked up at him from his sprawled position. Dethos is in the lobby, he said, rubbing his face that had heavily collided with the door. It was going to bruise later, he was sure of it. The God of War jumped off his colleague and speed walked down the corridor to meet the person he'd been trying not to think about all day. How had he even got here on his own? Was Ulrich with him? Did they know where he was? Had they even noticed that he wasn't at the palace of the Wheat God? A spark of hope began to burn in the pit of his stomach that out of everything, Dethos had forgotten. Maybe, just maybe, how to get here was something that had not been lost. He had walked the path from his own residence here and back so many times, maybe it had engraved its way into his brain. That felt like a highly fanciful thought. It was highly possible that Dethos had just asked someone along the way how to get here. It wasn't uncommon for someone to have to point a lost deity in the right direction, especially if they were coming from the lower city. The other person wouldn't have even thought of. I wouldn't even. The other person wouldn't have even thought twice about it. That hurt his heart to think about, but it was most likely the truth of what had happened. Before he could make himself too depressed by his own thoughts getting upset about something that he had no right to even be upset about, he rounded the corner. It was for the better that the God of Wheat didn't remember. Magdaldia shouldn't have foolish thoughts of him only remembering the good parts, only remembering the ones beneficial to himself. I'm a monster, Algaldia thought. The office which now The office, which until now had been frozen in motion and as silent as a grave, suddenly burst into movement once more upon seeing their boss stride through the door. No one wanted to be seen looking in on what was probably going to be a private moment between two of their seniors. A familiar blonde goddess patted him comfortingly on the shoulder as she passed him, holding a large bag in her other hand. No doubt it was filled with maps that needed to be redrawn as the borders of countries moved, yet again. In the rush to get out of the way and to look like they were doing something important, two junior assistants dropped their swords into the decorative tiles that made up the floor, causing a abrasively loud clanging sound to ring around the room in its relative silence. It reverberated around the stone-built room, elongated by the high ceiling. Another junior, shocked by the sound of the swords hitting the floor, accidentally knocked over a candle, setting fire to a stack of prayers that went up like a small bonfire. Someone rushed over with water and put out the small fire, but the damage to the papers and to Tethos was already done. The god of war had already started walking over to Dethos to greet him and inquire how he could be of help today. Dethos was still standing in the doorway, where previously his face had been filled with uncertainty. It was now overflowing with terror. Elgaldia started running, having seen the glazed overlook in the other's eyes. He'd seen it yesterday and had not acted quickly or decisively enough to be of any help. Now he was willing to do anything to not hear the smaller god's screams once more. Dethos was shaking, breaths coming shallowly, his chest rising and falling as rapidly as the flap of a hummingbird's wing. He was having a panic attack. Elgaldia swore, closing the distance between them in record time. He whispered to him, trying to draw him from wherever his mind had taken him. Is it all right if I touch you? He asked, his own heart beating a terrified drum roll, each beat merging into the next until there was only the general feeling of aching within. His own panic beginning to rise the longer Dethos stood there, silent and frozen, with his wide eyes seeing nothing. There had been no response to his question, so he asked again, this time a little louder, hoping also to try orientating him to where he was standing. Dethos, you're standing in the lobby of the War Department. I'm Elgaldia, god of war, and I promise you that you are safe here. He took a deep breath, and then continued in as softly and friendly a voice as he could. Is it all right if I touch you? Sounds from the office behind reminded Elgaldia that they currently had an audience. He gestured to his staff to clear the room. Dethos didn't need to have people talking about this around the city later. He'd be confined to his house again. Making everyone keep their mouths shut was going to be top priority once the wheat god calmed down. Do you work elsewhere? Elgardic commanded, a hint of danger in his voice, if the remaining staff didn't quickly get out of there and stop staring at Tethos. Having a panic attack in public was embarrassing enough itself without having a full-on audience of people staring at you the whole time. Staring and not helping. Elgardi would have to have words with his subordinates about their manners and ensure they all retook the mental health awareness training he and Omdum had developed. But that could wait. He was needed for something more urgent right now. Dethos had eventually nodded. His head had moved ever so slightly when he'd asked him for consent to touch him. It was the only way that he could think of bringing the other comfort. The memory of hugging and crying Dethos surrounded by the camellia flowers his garden was so famous for resurfaced. That night he'd comforted Dethos with a protective hug and thousands of pats to his back before he'd fallen asleep. He kept up his chant of how things were going to be okay, interspersed with continued attempts to reorientate him. With his arms now around the god of wheat, he could feel just how much he was shaking. The smaller god was basically vibrating at this point. His hand gripped the wood of the door frame so tightly that his sharp nails were embedded in the grain of it. Sparks of Dethos's power were emanating from his back, odd embers passing through Elgaldia's arms, where they encircled the other's waist. It wasn't painful, each ember merely tickled as it did so, but it was still worrying to see. Rubbing Dethos's back seemed as though it was having some effect on him. The glaring sparks were fewer, and the god of wheat's back muscles weren't as taut as they had been previously. Elgardia looked down at Dethos's legs, wondering whether to momentarily leave to get him a chair. Beneath their feet, a patch of fluffy moss was growing over the tiles. Dark green and delicately it spread, reaching the wall and beginning to climb up it. Nearby desks that made up the reception area were now sporting a lush crop of wheat that was so ripe that the stalks all bent under the weight of the grain. Its roots penetrated the wood of the furniture, gripping tightly to them and dangling almost to the floor in a sort of root curtain. Dax finally blinked, seeming to snap out of it. Out of what? Bleh. Dax finally blinked, seeming to snap out of wherever the fireman's sword clashing had taken him, and said, "Thank you, but we really need to talk." Mini theatre. Junior 1, have you seen my desk? Junior 2, the wheat is a nice addition. Junior 1, how am I supposed to do any work with a field growing on my desk? Junior 2, then harvest it? Junior 1, Boss won't let us clean up after not greeting Dethos properly on Tuesday. Junior 2, would it have killed anyone to offer him a drink? Could you have even said hi to him? Junior 1, you weren't there, it was scary. Junior 2, you're a martial goddess. You were scared of a cereal god with the powers of your average 4-year-old plant spirit? Arthur, be glad you weren't at work that day. Truly, truly be glad you weren't at work that day. Chapter 39, Bad Memories, Part 1. Alcaldia looped arms with Dax and guided him through the maze of buildings that made up the War Department's work complex. Although it stood on the same hill as the palace he had inherited, it resembled a university campus more than a home. They passed training fields, a shooting range, several fortified armories, a canteen, military intelligence and research, and development buildings, until Algaldia found what he was looking for. The pair stopped outside of a large building, but did not enter, instead passing through a wrought iron gate into a small enclosed garden, shielded from the wind by a curved brick wall. There were various ornamental grasses planted around the space, gently swaying in the slight breeze that had managed to circumvent the shelter provided by the wall. This was certainly a place private enough for the conversation Dax wanted to have with Elgaldia. It was quiet, the risk of them being overheard was pretty low, and being able to see the sky was soothing. Dax could feel his hands shaking, and he didn't really know how he was keeping himself upright after the burst of energy he just let escape from him in the War Department's administrative office. He'd only been able to walk this far because Elgaldia had let him lean on his proffered arm more and more as his legs became increasingly shaky. Hopefully, the plants that were now sort of infesting the administrative office would be easy to remove. As the pair walked, Dax truly admired the planting and the fact that the god of war hadn't brought him to some large, beige, sweaty conference room. Ornamental grass brushed his bare ankle, tinkling, not what it was doing, tickling the delicate skin there as he reached a bench. That was new, Dax said, looking at his hands, only not noticing now that they were covered in a thin layer of moss. Its rust and green, succulent like clusters, increased in density the closer they were to the tips of his fingers. It was starting to feel a little itchy. He nervously rubbed the palms of his hands together, hoping that the friction would help get it off. Nothing changed. He wasn't shaking anymore, but he was intensely embarrassed. Dax could feel his cheeks heating more and more, and he didn't need to see to know that they were bright red. It seemed like every time he left the house, his track record of returning without completely destroying his self-esteem and public image tanked again. Do you feel any better? Elgaldia asked, brushing some of the moss off of his own clothes where it had fallen, sprinkling him with the fine dust of plant matter. I honestly don't know. He countered. The sheer panic had left his voice, but it had been replaced with just as much, if not more, embarrassment. He didn't feel like he was dying the way he had before, but Dax still felt like the ground could swallow him whole at any moment. Clanging from the swords and the scent of smoke had knocked whatever he had wanted to ask Elgaldia out of his mind for a while. Now, after standing in the garden for a few minutes, staring up at the sky, he was reminded what he, what it was he had been so desperate to ask, what he'd wanted to ask since recovering the memories in Mother Willow's garden. Look, he sighed, looking up at Elgaldia's concerned face. His legs were starting to burn, and he didn't want to draw out this conversation for any longer than it had to be. What was I like before all of this? Some of the memories are coming back, the god of war asked, his face contracted in concern. He reached out gingerly as if expecting Dax to viciously reject him, but when he didn't, placed a hand reassuringly on his shoulder. Yes, some, Dax answered. He was now staring fixedly at a butterfly that had landed on the fluffy head of a clump of fountain grass, so that the god of war's piercing gaze wouldn't distract him from what it was he wanted to say. Dreams from the believers were still hanging out in his head, caught in a loop of memory, unsure whether to fully reassure or to resurface or to fade back into the darkness from whence they had come. Elgaldia was probably worried about what memories he had recalled, and if what Mother Willow had said was true, he was probably even more concerned that it was those from the battle. Then I guess I won't be able to talk to you like this for much longer. The comforting hand dropped away, now clasped tightly by Elgaldia's other free one behind his back. His voice had quivered on want, and Dax had noticed the watery look in the other's eyes from the corners of his own. The butterfly had red wings. What makes you think that? Dax questioned. Dethos might have cut off contact after what had happened, but Dax was just a stranger possessing his body, doing his best not to get noticed. Normally he would be worried that the system would reprimand him for being so OOC and pull out the threat of sending his soul into the void again, but there was no such threat. The system had remained quiet ever since he decided to sneak out of Dethos' palace to ask his questions, so right now Dax was feeling emboldened. He could only make guesses as to the feelings and thoughts of the god of war, devoid as he was of most of Dethos' memories of Elgaldia. Right now he was left purely with his own understanding of the man, after his own interactions with him, and the incomplete slideshow of memories that belonged to Dethos. People must have told you what I did by now. Elgaldia was shifting from foot to foot, now looking like he would give anything to be able to run away from this situation. Dax sighed, rubbing both of his own hands across his face as he moved flopping down into a sitting position on the fancy enamel tiles that made up the garden path. They had little roses on them, surrounded by a midnight blue and gold geometric pattern. Very beautiful, very tasteful, very uncomfortable to sit on. The, the design mirrored the actual roses dotted around the garden, beautiful yellows and oranges peeking out through the tall, ornamental grasses that had dominated his attention until now. Whoever had picked them out had great taste. Dax was just admiring them, just appreciating the art in the middle of a conversation. Totally hadn't had his legs give out underneath him at all. They were shaking again, and as he didn't want to be fussed about because of it, Dax decided to deflect from that by continuing this awkward conversation. I've certainly heard some things. It was vaguer than he had intended. Elgaldia visibly deflated in front of him. But I'd rather hear about it directly from you than from broken memories and gossipy heavenly realm deities, Dax explained. He expected Elgaldia to avoid the conversation. His heart pounded in his chest, wafting in the silence that spread out between them like a chasm. But he didn't avoid the subject. Instead, Elgaldia vowed to fill Dax in on what had happened from his own perspective. Nervousness was easy to see in the twitching of the god of war's eyes. Dax patted the ground next to him, inviting him to take a seat. Recounting the past wasn't something that would take a small amount of time. His neck couldn't take craning up to see the other's face, as handsome as it may be, the entire time that was happening. The sun was also angrily glaring into his eyes like a laser, and that was intolerable. Dax refused to hold a conversation with someone where he was unable to keep his eyes open. Squinting at someone seemed like it might be rude. Leaving Elgaldia standing there on his own also felt rude. The system, which had until now not even manifested in its glowing orb form, butted in just as Elgaldia looked like he was going to start speaking again. Congratulations. 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 Appeared on the system's interface. It flashed neon pink and yellow before being replaced with a less seizure-inducing sky blue and lavender. Angsty. Backstory. Unlocked. In a font size that had to be the largest available. He wondered if they had to have it custom made. Personal websites in 2002 were less eye-wateringly ugly. The system seemed to be reveling in its extremely questionable graphic design choices, as in as spelling problem as a lime green tacky font. As in a lime green tacky font, it showed the points from this unlock rolling in. This unlock's points were actually insane. To think that it had taken him so long to accrue enough points for the first purchasable item, and here he was sitting on a tiled patio floor, a practical millionaire, unable to purchase anything. The status of his previous redeems download mocked him from the loading bar that was filling so slowly it felt like it wasn't moving at all. Elgaldir had, in the time he was interacting with the system, joined him sitting on the enamelled tiled pathway. So they sat side by side as the god of war talked of the old days Dax had yet to remember. We were sworn brothers in those days. He hesitated, looking at Dax as if he was reassuring himself that it was really okay to talk about this with him. Dax tried to smile encouragingly. Back then, the deities living in the underworld were called demons, and the place itself referred to as the demon realm. Bulmar, self-titled emperor of the demon realm, led them in an effort to overthrow the heavenly realm. Elgaldir's look of disgust when he mentioned the name Bulmar was palpable. The war had been raging for many years when the forces of my predecessor finally managed to turn the tide. Dax imagined some faceless sea deity physically turning the tide around and almost choked himself when suppressing the snort of laughter that threatened to bubble up. This wasn't the time to be laughing at the curveballs his brain was giving him. OOC traits detected, System warned, flashing red. Dax quickly rearranged his face to that of a pious altar boy, leaning on every word spoken. As you should, System chided. This is important backstory that you are really going to regret not listening to because I am not going to explain to you. The place we chased them to was the valley beneath the mountain village, your temple. Your founding temple was located. Elgarder's brow was becoming increasingly furrowed the longer he talked. We fought in the valley. I sent someone to warn you. I don't know if they got to you in time. You were there. I think it was spring. There was a big festival. It was the marriage festival. There was a tradition to marry after the spring wheat had been sown. Dax added. Where the words had come from, he had no idea, but they felt right. For a fertility deity, spring is very busy. What he had said had thrown Elgaldi off of his stride. Words that had just been falling out of his mouth dried up, and he took several minutes carefully pondering the next words to say. The battle had started on the borders of the heavenly realm, now encroached on the mortal. The battle that had started on the borders of the heavenly realm now encroached on the mortal world. Blasts of divine and demon powers thrown around without thought of one another could cause untold damage here. It was the humans that were most in danger. None of their weapons could damage an immortal, and even their greatest of heroes could be felled with just a flick of a finger from an immortal who would barely even notice what they had done. The humans fled, scattering in every direction of the compass as their homes were lost to forest fires, floods, terrible winds, plagues. Hail the size of oxen rained down from the sky, crushing everything beneath them. Great fissures opened in the earth, everything standing above them sliding into the bright glow of the molten rock below. What was left standing crumpled as the ground shook violently beneath them. Houses, land, and families were utterly destroyed in the warring deity's path. The prayers, wishes, and fears of the believers in the face of this unprecedented destruction only fanned the flames, each of them increasing the power in the hands of those causing misery. Humans started believing that they were living in the end times. The end of the world truly had felt like it was only moments away. The ground buckled, lava bubbling up only for these fissures to be slammed close again, forming jagged ridges of rock. Buildings fell like playing cards, silos burst, mountains crumpled, and waves crashed over harbour walls, pulling everything they touched back to lie in the dark, briny depths. Many people chose to seek shelter in Many people chose to seek shelter in your temple, Elgaldia explained. Dax could only imagine how terrified they must have been fleeing from one disaster only to find themselves in a place no safer than the one which they had left behind. They trusted me to keep them safe, like I kept the harvest safe, he said. These words, too, he'd had no idea he was going to say until they were already coming out of his mouth. Dax stole a look at the system, casually sitting on a rose flower, its orb now safely returned to its usual contented golden glow. I knew the battle was drawing too close to you, but there was nothing I could do to prevent it. Things were going very badly, the god of war explained. His eyes were getting teary again, and he had to swallow several times before being able to continue on with the tale. The Heavenly Realm's army, mobilized by the former god of war, paled in number compared to their opponent's forces. Every single demon, shade, and evil spirit had flowed out of the demon realm, swarming them from every side. Human belief bolstered one side of the war, but their fear had the same effect on the other. The longer the battle took, and the more carnage and destruction it wrought, the stronger that fear grew. Elgaldia had tried to get a warning to Dethos. He tried to do that himself, tried to get to the temple so that he at least could help defend it, for he'd been the god of peace 4,000 years ago. The god of peace had very little power in a war viewed as good versus evil. How were you meant to write a peace treaty with something everyone thought was evil? There had been someone that had heard his pleas, a fervent believer in peace, who had taken the path up the mountain to warn Dethos. A human Elgaldir could never forget. He'd made his priests count them among the martyrs for peace, whose names were chanted in the temples to Elgaldir, hoping for their own ascension when they would serve at his side. Murals and statues lined his temples as reminders of what he stood for. If things had not totally gone to shit already at that point, then they definitely had, the moment Bulmar, Emperor of the Demon Realm, took to the field. It had been hours that the former god of war had battled with him, from high mountain peak to waist deep in the mud churned up by the river. A fight that had taken hours was ended by one blow of the giant axe Bulmar wielded. It came hammering down on the spiritual shield of the god of war. Sparks flew, catching nearby dry grass on fire. As the shield splintered, it surfaced a crazed mass of stress fractures. Instead of the glorious self-sacrificing death that saved the world, simultaneously taking out the bad guy and ending in a long speech about the nature of good and evil the humans had expected, well, the death of the god of war was short, bloody, and brutal. No time for any inspiring last words, no rallying cry. In history remembered only as a footnote somewhere near the end of the book. He deserved better. Many did who had died there. There wouldn't be time to mourn him. There wasn't time nor space to. They were facing the end of everything. Elgaldia, a god who, in the grand scheme of things, had a laughably small amount of power. Peace was notoriously weak and thus easily broken. Found himself thrust into the spotlight, his rank flying from the most junior position in the War Department staff to the God of War trademark in minutes. It made no sense. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of martial deities belonging to the War Department, all older with bigger followings and considerably more experience than Elgaldir. Power surged through him so strongly that it had blown him clear off of his feet. Crawling back up out of the freezing river water had cooled his head a little, but coordinating his limbs had been pretty hard to do. Elgaldia felt like he had been carrying around a large boulder, and suddenly someone had taken off what he hadn't even known was there. Every moment, every movement, thought, and pulse of magic barely took any attention or intention to make happen. It was like giving someone a chainsaw to open an envelope. The humans believed that he could be the god of war, and so he was. That was the beauty and the horror of belief. The death of his mentor and the continued threat to Dethos and his temple full of believers were things he couldn't ignore. But any plans he might have come up with were soon dashed. He didn't even get a chance to process his change in employment as Bulmar, Emperor of the Demon Realm, turned his attention to him. Steam was pouring out of every crevice of the demon's armor that was soot-stained and dented by his previous fight. The axe that had killed Ilgaldi's predecessor was still embedded in his chest, hooked beneath what remained of the body's ribcage. Despite attempting to yank it free, Bulmar was forced to draw another blade. He pulled one-handed from behind his back, a scythe. Wielding a scythe marked the Emperor for what he had once been, a lowly death god, a collector of mortal souls. The blade of the scythe was stained golden by the dried blood of the heavenly realm's residents unfortunate enough to cross his path, residents who would never see their home again. Its serrated edge was magnificent in its horror. As Bulmar closed the gap between them, he stood on the body as it slowly disintegrated into a pile of shimmering sand. All that was left of a god worshipped the world over, whose mantle Ilgaldir would have to take up if he wanted anyone to survive. A wave of red light pulsed from the scythe as Bulmar swung it over his head. Algaldi, now god of war, lifted his own sword in an attempt to parry the blade's magical blast. The leaf-shaped blade exploded into a cloud of shrapnel, and he was once again blown backwards, though he managed to remain on his feet this time. The rocky outcrop he found himself standing on was way too close to Dethos's temple. He could feel it tremble beneath its feet. Looking back up the mountain, Algaldia saw a chunk of stone hit the roof of the wheat god's holy place, and a tear ran down the dried blood covering his his cheek. Teeth and cheek, two different things. Two very different things. He had to save Dethos. Bulmar laughed at him from behind his closed helmet, only his wild eyes visible beyond the metal. Algaldia no longer had a weapon, and the power that had destroyed it had damaged Dethos's temple. From where he was standing, Algaldia could see the extensive chipping of the intricate carving the shrapnel had caused, not to mention the partial destruction of the roof. Damage to his temple was damage to Dethos himself. Anything that caused Dethos pain was unacceptable. Algaldia, the god known for his calm demeanor and reluctance to fight, felt all of that melt away. It was as if it never existed. Right now, at this very moment, he was really fucking angry. An arm outstretched found the giant sword of the god of war's hilt fly into it. His fingers tightened around the hilt of it, communing with the sword spirit within the metal. Their meeting caused even more power to flow into his body, bursting out of him like sparks of lightning. His skin itched. Algaldia felt like his body could explode at any moment. He was giving off sparks almost constantly and vibrating due to the pressure of prayers now laid upon him, and his rage could no longer be contained. With a sudden lunge, he attempted to plunge the unwieldy sword through the armor of an ancient demon standing before him. Bulmar was still laughing. Just as Bulmar had fought with one god of war, so did he fight with this newly emerged one. From the summit of a mountain to the valley floor, in mud, in water, and stood on precarious rock outcrops overlooking deep pools of lava, dueling every bit of it, testing their blades against one another. Sometimes the Emperor of the Demon Realm stood before him, a human man dressed in soot-blackened armor. At others he swirled around him as nothing more than a quickly moving, impenetrable red mist. Bulmar's every move was a carefully choreographed dance, contrasted by Algaldia's own slow and overly forceful movements. He was barely in control of his manifested form. Every time the sword clashed with the scythe's blade, the vibration rang up his arm, making his fingers go numb. The demon emperor was intentionally trying to draw him closer and closer to the temple of Dethos, and for a while he didn't notice, so intent was Algaldia to keep a hold on his sword. Its sheer size was almost overwhelming, so used to a short sword was he. Realizing that what was happening, that was what was happening, sent him into a panic that almost got him killed as his opponent swung his scythe again. The shing as it passed off through the air was his only warning as it passed across his stomach, giving him enough time to take a healthy leap backwards to not lose any of his organs. It wasn't a big enough jump to come away entirely unscathed, despite the last second leap. The jump had left him unsteady on his feet, and he fell, dislodging stones as he went slipping down the side of the mountain. It wasn't until he reached the bottom covered in dirt and dislodged gravel that Algaldia noticed the blood seeping through his clothing and light armor. It was even longer than that before he felt the pain catch up with him. High up on the mountain, Bulmar was bent over double, laughing for some time. Then he began to give an intensely forgettable speech, the sort of speech a villain gives, full of arrogance, that they are going to win and there is nothing the hero can do to stop them from winning just before they get their asses handed to them by the hero. I won't bore you with the details. That was exactly what was happening at this moment until... Oh, shut up, Algaldia panted, holding his non-sword filled hand to the wound tightly as it continued bleeding. It was a good thing Dethos had talked him out of wearing white today. You'd never get the stains out, the weak god had said before handing him a set whose colours he approved of to wear. His wound was smarting, and his nerves were on edge. He didn't want to have to sit here and listen to this guy gloat, especially when they were still this close to the temple of the wheat god. Algaldia lost what little control he had over over his rage, and in turn over the newly gained powers at his disposal, just thinking about how endangered Ethos was. He didn't find out till much later the blade had been adulterated with mandrake, henbane, deadly nightshade, and devil's trumpet. Poison, but the sort of poison that made you hallucinate wildly rather than causing immediate death. The dosage concentrated and hidden beneath the dried blood. Coating, also coating the blade, would have almost instantly killed a human. Hello, Irish the cats. I hope you're having a good day. I am gonna end stream at the end of chapter, which isn't that far away. Just so you know, because my voice is dying, and it's nearly midnight. Yeah. I hope you had a nice Christmas and New Year if you celebrate Christmas. If you're someone I know, just know that I'm too tight right now to figure out. It took me a while, and Helen and Brooke, especially if you've changed name recently. It takes me a while to remember people, even in real life. I know it's nearly 2 years I've been doing this, which is crazy. Kristen, thank you for reminding me. I thought maybe that's Kristen because you had another name with cats in it, but I'm happy to see you. It is cold. It's supposed to snow here, so I think. The dosage concentrated and hidden beneath the dried blood, also coating the blade, would have almost instantly killed a human. Even with this knowledge, he still hadn't been able to forgive himself for the many things that followed after. Losing control was beyond terrifying when you had no idea of exactly how much damage you were capable of causing. Elgaldi had thrashed around on the floor like a wild animal, overcome by the pain of his wounds, expecting at any moment to feel the slicing blade coming down upon him again. But it didn't. He screamed, lunging for the still laughing bull maw. Powers now fully unrestrained. All sound seemed like it was far away. Or was he underwater? It didn't matter. He felt as if his entire body was on fire. Another spelling thing we've got to go fix. His entire body was on fire. Everything was burning. When he'd screamed, he'd given off a magical blast so strong that the entire mountain shook. Significant chunks of rock slid down its nearest face, barely being held back by Dethos's protective array. Elgaldia's vision turned entirely into a red mist as the humans sheltering in Dethos's temple began praying. He would protect them and their god. Where once he had been a reluctant soldier, he was now filled with bloodlust, all aimed with pinpoint precision at the Emperor of the Demon Realm. The humans were scared, the god of war said. He was visibly sweating. Dax reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, which he then gently dabbed Elgaldia's forehead with. The god of war was growing increasingly distressed the further into the story he got. Dax couldn't help but feel that his own need for answers may have been rather selfish. He reached out and patted his companion's knee. They were very scared. It was the first time they had seen the sheer devastation deities from both realms could do. I don't remember when you came outside, Elgalia said. He was holding his head in his hands to hide the tears starting to spill from his eyes. Hey, Peach. How you doing? Welcome to the Chaos stream. At the moment, we're struggling to read my own writing. I am pretty tired. Uh, but other than that, I'm doing alright. Uh, just general, my body falling apart problems. Nothing, nothing new. We're reading my old NaNoWriMo uh, attempt. I'm glad that you like. I'm at the point of editing and like reading it where like I hate it. I've seen it. Been in my head since like 2020. And I'm like, this is chapter 39. And I'm like in the late 50s editing chapters. And there's like another 60 that I have to do. The scary part is getting into the 60s, the chapters in the 60s, because they're ones I haven't touched since 2022. And some real rough word counts to deal with. Like this chapter, these two chapters, 39 and 40, were like one, and I had to chop them in half because they were too long. But there's some where I look at the number and I'm like, oh no. Like a chapter that has 28 words in it. What is that? I don't know. I won't know till I get them. And that's a little bit scary. The humans were scared, the god of war said. He was visibly sweating. Dax reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, which he then gently dabbed Algaldi's forehead with. The god of war was growing increasingly distressed the further into the story he got. Dax couldn't help but feel like his own need for answers may have been rather selfish. He reached out and patted his companion's knee. They were very scared. It was the first time they had seen the sheer devastation deities from other realms could do. Other realms, both realms. There's only three, I think. I'm the one that made this world. I think there's three. The heavenly realm, the quote unquote demon realm, which changes name, and then the human realm, which is sometimes called the mortal world. Because I forget that I've called it the human realm. Sometimes. Uh, I don't remember when you came outside, Elgaldia said. He was holding his head in his hands to hide the tears starting to spill from his eyes. These same tears he'd tried so hard to hide dripped from his hands, wetting the rose tiles they were sitting on. Dax decided not to remark on them. The man was embarrassed enough, already without him pointing out that attempts to hide them had been ineffective. When Dethos had left the relative safety of his temple and entered the battlefield, might not be remembered by the god of war 4,000 years after the fact, but Dax suddenly found that he could. Mini theatre, author, battle scenes are so hard to write. Crying face. Dethos, then don't do it. Arthur, how else am I supposed to kill you off? Dethos, I mean, you did kill my replacement with beef noodles and a keyboard. I'm sure you could have thought of something. Arthur, you overestimate my ability. And since it's a part two, I'm just going to read chapter 40 because, you know, might as well while I'm here. While I'm here, while you're here. Chapter 40. Before I do that, it's been 3 hours since the last time I did it. Here's a link to the book if you want to ever go to the cursed place that is Wattpad, or as I call it, the Shadow Realm. Chapter 40. Bad Memories Part 2. Huddled in every room of the temple dedicated to Dethos, god of wheat. Also, I should have said this earlier. This chapter Probably gory, I think, if I remember correctly. This is the gory one. The other one was like, battle, bad things happen. I think this is the gory one. Or that would be 41. But I thought I'd warn you just in case that's not something you want to be around for. Huddled in every room of the temple dedicated to Dethos, god of wheat, were humans and the things that they had managed to flee their homes with. Someone had herded their small flock of goats up the mountain to seek shelter. Confused bleating from the goats was interrupted by crying children, scared by their own sudden flight from home and the sounds coming from outside. Even there, groups of grandmothers had formed, all huddled together, knitting as if there wasn't a war between the immortal powers happening in the valley below, as if this wasn't the end of the world. From their gossiping, you could have thought that they were in a cafe on a pleasant Tuesday, so they sat where they pleased and knit things so little Timmy wouldn't so they knit things so little Timmy wouldn't be cold, and refused to be moved to safer rooms with unarmed women, children, the sick and infirm. I'm 91. I've seen worse. Do you remember the storm at 57? You'll need to store me up. You'll need me to store you up if anything happens. I'll tell you something for free. Do you think I'm scared of some demon who thinks he's better than our Defos? That lad's got another thing coming if I haven't anything to say about it. I'll give him a clatter around the ears. I'll let you know that right here, right now. Some of the choice responses to anyone even daring to inquire if they would like to go sit somewhere safer. Aftershocks from the many magical attacks being slung rocked the temple as dust fell from the ceilings, lights swung, and mosaic tiles fell. 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 Fail. Fell. They fell. People were scared. An old man, wizened with age, sporting a beard long enough to stay on the floor, stood up from his seat near the fire to try and calm the gathered masses. In his hands a staff of crabapple wood, topped by a purple crystal, both walking aid and tool of his trade. He was wearing the simple brown clothing that marked him as one of the temple's assistants, and that was enough for most of the people around the temple fire to fall silent. Dethos himself was floating above the temple fire, doing his damn best to keep these people safe. Human conversations taking place below him was something he was only barely aware of. Every every molecule of his attention and power was being spent strengthening the ward he was using to defend the temple and its inhabitants. There wasn't the luxury of being able to worry about other things or other people. Elgaldia was out there somewhere, fighting for his life, and Dethos couldn't allow even that to distract him. His temple hadn't been built to withstand a battle like this. It had been built as a good place to store grain, a fancy grain silo. The gods are mighty, though. They have little thought or care for us mere mortals, a young man shouted. His head was still poking out of the main door of the temple, gazing out into the horror beyond, half in amazement at the destruction, half in terror. He couldn't look away, even as it drew closer to them. A woman that turned out to be his mother grabbed him by the back of his neck and dragged him back into the safety of the temple. She hit him several times on his back and shoulders with one of her shoes, scolding him for putting his life at risk so stupidly. Do you want your head blown off? Dethos loves us. He is here with us, even as his own family is at risk in this battle. He protects us as he protects the harvest. As he brings love to us, so as he shares his love to us, so do we return our love to him. The voice of the elderly temple assistant, strong in his conviction, led them in prayer. The temple shook once more, almost knocking people off of their feet. Congratulations, you survived the outbreak. The temple shook once more, almost knocking people off of their feet. A few of the grandmothers swore as the shudders of the mountain caused them to drop some stitches of the garments they were furiously knitting. A lady rushed forward and twisted from her finger the wedding ring she had worn for 20 years and placed it in the temple fire, an offering. Smoke covered it almost instantly, but it did not melt, merely laying in the glowing coals as the flames licked its surface. Dethos will protect us. He will protect those that we love. He will protect those that he loves, she prayed. A man hobbled over the fire on crutches. He struggled to untie something from around his wrist whilst balancing on his one good leg. Others held him as he looked at the plaited hair, tied there wistfully. In the end, he had to cut it with a borrowed penknife, and as he dangled it over the fire, conviction overcame his reluctance to be parted from it. The god of war will win this fight, he said. Letting go of the hair, it was gone in seconds. A bright burst of flame, leaving only charred remains behind. The temple door shook. Someone was banging on the other side to come in. The door was not locked, nor was it yet barred, so opening it for the person wanting to come in would have been easy. Nobody wanted to risk it, though. For all they knew, some crazy demon was on the other side of it trying to tempt them out. A fistfight nearly broke out when the man that had stuck his head out earlier opened the door and pulled the person in before anyone could prevent him. His mother practically ripped the shirt off of his back in her fear for his life. The visitor fell through the door, a mess of blood, sweat, and tears. Getting here had not been an easy task. Everyone in the room pressed closer to see what they could do to help. Pushing aside the pain of his injuries, the terrified man shoved his way through the crowd, all elbows and wide eyes, until he collapsed on his knees, sweating profusely at the edge of the temple fire. A small scroll of paper he had produced from some secret inner pocket was thrust into the flames. The contents of the letter would only be known to three people: Elgaldia, Dethos, and the messenger. The coarse paper it was written on was rapidly consumed by the flames, producing large amounts of smoke. Wafting upwards, the smoke reached the floating god, still maintaining the protection wards of the temple. Dethos's eyes snapped open. He swallowed, mouth dry from the exertion of keeping his primary place of worship in one piece, as the ground trembled yet again. Elgaldia's words, written to warn him of just how bad things might go, did the opposite of what the god of peace treaties had hoped. He was going to have to venture out into the valley, out onto the battlefield, where once wheat fields lay filled with germinating grains that would no longer be harvested in the dry summer heat. The tramping of soldiers' feet, of horses, and the way the ground had been scorched, poisoned, and churned up meant that this winter would be a harsh one. Hopefully there was enough grain stored to see them through it, if any of them survived. Distracted from maintaining the wards, Dethos was now better able to feel his believers' fear, the trust that they held in him, like a thin glowing ribbon that tied their faces together. Broken and dying wheat plants told him of the carnage that lay outside, of the desecration of the valley, his holy place, his home, the place where he had been born, once the spirit of a singular stalk of wheat, of grain, a loaf of bread, anthropomorphized, then given human form. He lived to keep these people alive. There was no way he was going to be able to protect them whilst hiding inside. So he stepped down among them, almost among them, not for the first time, but for what ominously felt like the last, and gave some parting words. Lock the door and await my return. Dethos placed a hand on the head of the aged temple assistant. He knew the man would do his best to lead them well in his absence. He left them with the knowledge of all the hidden spaces within the building and the importance of sheltering as far beneath the ground as they could. The wards shimmered as he exited their protection, reinforcing them as he stood overlooking the destruction. A loud slam as the doors were closed, locked and barred behind him, reminded Dethos why he was about to do what he was about to do, in order to protect his believers, the land that had given him life. And find Elgaldia, he was going to have to do something very brave, or very stupid. Only time would be able to tell the difference between the two. Rainbows of light resulting from hundreds of blasts of magical energy shone almost dazzlingly across the sky. From mountain to mountain, in every crevice of the valley, sounds of metal clashing against metal could be heard. What had started as a rockfall, almost at the peak of one of the mountains, quickly became a landslide that, as it careened down the mountain face, threw out chunks of chert, granite, labradorite, 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 quartz, and rhyolite. It choked the small river that ran through the valley, causing it to burst its banks, flooding what little was left of the fields. Dethos wanted to cry. Fighting up until this point of the war had mostly taken place in the respective realms of gods and demons. Why suddenly was everyone trashing his front garden when they decided to bring this fight to the mortal world? Why were they dragging humans into this at all? Dethos leant his hand against the temple protective ward, increasing the amount of energy he was giving it. Things were crazy out here. He didn't want them to fail, whilst he was distracted by other things. There was nothing left to do but set out to do that stupid brave thing. Despite the advantage of standing on an elevated position, scanning the battlefield for Galdia was not easy. Everyone looked tiny from up here. Smoke from burning fires, dust, and the light from everyone's godly powers made it feel like he was looking for a needle in a haystack. Tiny voices from the wheat guided him to the figure of someone glowing bright red, surrounded by massive discharges of superfluous energy. It was Elgaldia, but not as Dethos knew him, not as he had ever known him. Getting to him had been surprisingly easy. No one on either side dared to be within any of his attack ranges. Jumping down from the mountainside, caught by a rain cloud he'd summoned as he did so, Dethos examined the situation from a closer vantage point. Elgaldia was fighting the Emperor of the Demon Realm. Though he didn't seem to have much control over his limbs, they appeared leaden as if he was greatly fatigued. The ground shook beneath them as they traded blows. This, it seemed, was the cause of so much of the damage that had been done to his temple. Dethos flew closer, hoping to put up another protective ward between the pair fighting and his temple to reassure himself that the humans were guarded sufficiently from the earth tremors and the wild releases of magic. You'd also see that the only reason Elgaldia hadn't been killed by Bulmar was that his bursts of power were so large, strong, and completely unpredictable in their deployment. His heart clenched tightly in his chest each time their blades met. Fear that he wouldn't be able to reach them in time to help rose up cold in his throat. Dethos shivered as he urged the cloud to move faster, whilst trying not to get caught in a rogue blast as he did so. Elgaldia! Tethos shouted as he landed from his rain-cloud steed. Elgaldia did not respond. His eyes were a wide expanse of white eyeball. Pupils rolled back into his head. The whites of his eyes were more bloodshot gold than white. His armor was soaked in blood, and it seemed like Elgaldia had lost his helm a long time ago. Bulmar laughed once more, morphing into his gaseous form. A red mist of cloud enveloped both Dethos and Elgaldia, swirling around endlessly, taunting them. Dethos had not tied back his hair, and it whipped around them, wrapping uncomfortably around his neck and covering his eyes. What little he could see of Elgaldia was not good. Gold shone from both of his eyes and wounds to his face. His movements were becoming increasingly jerky and painful looking, like he was a puppet being pulled by several strings in rapid succession and not able to keep up with the puppeteer's demands. He didn't seem to recognize who was standing next to him. Dethos looked through the gaps in the dense encircling cloud for anyone or anything that might be able to help. Any chance of immediate backup, though, was thwarted by deities and demons both fleeing the area in close proximity to the duel. It was hard to concentrate on fighting someone when you were constantly having to dodge other people's stray blasts of energy. Those who had come from the heavenly realm, who had seen the death of the god of war, who could see which way the tide of the battle was likely going to turn, and who had served with Elgaldia for many years, had sent people back to beg for reinforcements. They'd even begged that the heavenly emperor, Venus, would come show his face on the battlefield. But even the fastest messenger would take time to get to the heavenly realm, and further time would be needed to gather reinforcements before returning. Demons were taking advantage of the increasingly unorganized tactics of the heavenly realm's soldiers, soldiers, to rally troops of their own in one of the mountain passes. In the dim light available to him, the god of wheat could see just how exhausted Elgaldia was looking. What armor he was wearing was covered in dents and slashes. In places, Bulmar's scythe had even cut through it entirely and through whatever he was wearing underneath. Blood was dripping from some wound on his torso that Dethos couldn't see clearly, pooling on the rocks beneath their feet. A tide pool of god blood. It was also becoming obvious to Dethos that the demon emperor had some kind of control over the struggling god beside him. Swinging the weight of the large sword in his hands threatened to knock him off of his own feet. With every attempt he made to strike at the heart of Bulmar, Dethos was going to have to do something to attempt to break the thrall, and what seemed like the most obvious decision was to get rid of Bulmar. Something easier said than done. He pushed down anxiety rising in his chest. There wasn't time for that right now. If they survived, Dethos could freak out about it later. He may not be a martial god, but that didn't mean that he was weak or incapable of fighting, especially not when he was on his own turf. People he cared about were at risk. He was worried, but as he ducked a scythe swiped from a Bulmar that had begun to coalesce into his solid form once more. He was well aware that his worry could get them all killed. His own powers revolved around growth, predominantly from wheat, but people did come to him for growing a relationship, and when they wanted children. Fighting someone took a little more imagination to accomplish than just hitting someone with a sharp bit of metal did. He reached out to any plants that were still living, to seeds laying dormant in the soil, to deep roots amongst the stone, his willpower winding like thick green ribbon around them. What could answer his call bursting forth from the soil? Vines rapidly grew at such an elevated speed that you could hear the creaking, despite the sounds of battle all around. Tendrils reached out, attempting to grasp any solid part of Bulmar, who was still laughing as he circled the pair of heavenly realm gods. When they met the red smoke that was his gaseous form, they wilted, decaying rapidly into a stinking goo. When they met his solid form, they thickened even as they decayed, forming rough calloused bark, before wrapping around his torso, passing him from vine to vine, like a pass the parcel present no one wanted to open. Bulmar hacked at them with his scythe, but its serrated blade caught in the grizzled bark of the decaying vine and canes, and he could only frenziedly saw away at them. Dethos sent more of his power directly into the vines, hoping to fully entrap him, but as he did so, the demon exploded in rage. Even the thickest of stems was not enough to endure his blast of necrotic energy. Bulmar was free again and had a new target, Dethos. You really think you're of any consequence to me? Bulmar laughed, fully coalescing into his humanoid form. There were similar dents and scratches in his armor as there was in Elgaldius, but he was not bleeding anywhere near as much. I would squash you between my two fingers like an overripe raspberry, said the self-proclaimed emperor of the demon realm, complete with expected hand gesture. Tethys had to bite his tongue not to laugh at such an overly dramatic villain speech. Try as he might, though, he couldn't hold it in any longer. The said demon lord tripped over a large chunk of quartz as he tried to march towards Elgaldier and him imperiously. Laughter, which soon became trapped in Tethos's throat as Bulmar painfully grabbed him by it. He was being choked, and one hand doing it might as well have been made of steel, for all the good that fighting to remove it did. Luckily, although it did hurt, and he was feeling a little dizzy, a god like himself didn't actually need to breathe. At this point, it was mostly a habit. It really freaked out humans if you didn't breathe around them. Bulmar turned to him forcefully. Bulmar turned him forcefully by the neck to face Elgaldier. The sight he made was horrifying. Blood was streaming from the tear ducts of his eyes. It ran down his face, dripping down his armor, mingling with blood from his serious wound, and collecting in the widening pool beneath his feet. Dethos wondered seriously for the first time how much blood is in a god. What would it take to die from blood loss? Could a god die from blood loss? Elgadi was screaming. If this was a Chinese cultivation novel, he would be a hair's breadth away from chi deviating. But very basically, stuffing the power of the god of war into someone else was overwhelming. He had been the god of peace treaties, a much lower position with significantly lower amounts of believers. He hadn't even been the god of peace in its entirety, though other people in the war department had a habit of calling him that. His current manifestation's capacity for holding power was horrifyingly low in comparison. It was like trying to fit the ocean into a teacup. Power was overflowing everywhere. It formed a thick black smoke of its own, filled with glittering red hot sparks. Dethos kicked out a Bulmar, hoping to break his hold on his throat, but the older demon was much stronger. He'd lifted him up off of the floor purely with one hand on his neck. The pain made it hard to think. Bulmar's free hand was at his waist, channeling his own power to hurt him further. Dethos concentrated whatever parts of his mind that could be distracted from the pain of maintaining the link, sending power to the protective wards. He couldn't let them fall, no matter what. When the smoke hit him, it had no effect on the demon holding him hostage, considering that this had been smoke for a large part of the fight Dethos had witnessed. That wasn't too surprising. He could barely see Elgaldir and could no longer call out for him. Confusion was beginning to manifest, although it was mostly hidden by the sheer agony still present on the face of the former god of peace treaties. Calling to him for help probably wouldn't do anything. With how badly his eyes were bleeding, Dethos doubted whether Elgaldir could do anything at all at this point. Bulmar raised his scythe in the hand that had previously been holding onto Dethos's waist, aiming to throw it at the new god of war. Dethos thrashed wildly in his other hand, and by some freak coincidence managed to kick it out of his hands with his foot. The blade sliced into the foot of the demon, and he swore profusely, though the axe blade was tainted by the self-same poison coursing through Elgaldi's veins. It did not affect him. It was a portion of a demonic nature, and well, he was a demon, so it didn't really affect him. Poison might not have chemically altered his mood, but being sliced by your own weapon because of a mere serial god had kicked you, as a demon wanting to rule the world, that smarted. That bruised your ego. He returned his attention to the still thrashing god dangling from where he was holding him 3 feet off the ground. In one swift motion, Bulmar pulled a curved knife from somewhere about his person and went to cut open Dethos's unprotected stomach. He tried to scream, but all that came out of his mouth was a strangled, gurgling noise. The weak god began to close his eyes, not wanting to witness his own disembowelment, but the sting of the knife never came. A bright flash of red light swirled around him. Dethos fell crumpling into a pile on the floor as the hand holding him up lost its grip. It took several seconds for him to be able to regain both his feet and his mind, and when he did so, Elgardia was standing between him and Bulmar, his giant sword raised high above his head. Gone was the unsure grasp, though it still wavered in his hands. The weight must be almost unbearable, Dethos thought as he looked up at him, trying to gauge whether he was back in his right mind or not. Everything about him was red. His skin glowed. Red light burst from him with every step he took towards his goal. It emanated from the sword, as if it had its own personal grudge with the demon standing before Elgaldir. I don't really know what happened after that for a little bit. The memory isn't very clear, Dax said as he repositioned himself a little closer to Elgaldir, who was looking thoroughly miserable. Neither do I, Elgaldir said. I do remember that there were many falling red flowers at one point, he considered. Was that you? It it was a sword move I was pretty well known for. Grace of the Falling Camellia. Elgaldia snorted at the name. I guess you didn't name it. Dax joked, poking the god of war in the ribs with his feet, trying to wring any enjoyment, any drop of fun out of this several hours long mutual trauma jump of a conversation. He was holding out, despite being very hungry, because he knew how important putting the truth of his death in context was going to be moving forwards. No, I don't think I've ever used it since. Elgaldia pulled a sour looking smile. Probably because you have half a ton of camellia flowers to sweep up after every time you do it, Dax thought. Probably not something that made you want to practice it all that often. Got to be very cool to see in person. Unfortunately, Dethos's memory of the sword move was missing. A real bummer. They had to work together to piece what the remaining memories they both had of the rest of the fight together. Bulmar had thrown both a knife he had threatened to gut Dethos with and his scythe at Elgaldia in retaliation, as he bled from several thousand cuts given by the flower petals. Dethos had lunged, trying to at least get in the way of the blades, but he had been several seconds too late. The knife whistled past its target's head. The scythe, too, had been aimed at Elgaldia's head, but its weight and non-aerodynamic shape meant that when he failed to parry it or move out of its trajectory, the tip lodged itself in his left shoulder just above his collarbone. Poison yet again leached into his new wound from the blade. Look, the god of war cursed, pulling it out and throwing it back at his attacker. It missed as Bulmar retreated, running back to his troops. For a split second, Dethos thought of chasing after him, despite knowing that it was almost surefire. It was an almost surefire death wish. His heart hammered away in his chest as he instead reached out to help Elgaldier, who had gone startlingly pale. He looked like he might faint at any moment. Quick, I'll take you to Omdom, Dithos said, trying to put the much taller god's arm over his shoulder so that he could help make him walk. Tears were threatening to spill from his eyes, seeing the state Elgaldia was in. This wasn't the time to cry, nor was it the time to let his fear of the poison's effects slow him down. There would be time for tears later when they were off of the battlefield and the poison was out of Elgaldia's system. Now was the time for action. If he could have lifted up the other god and ran with him in his arms, Dethos would have done so. But even if he hadn't been wearing all of the armor, Elgaldia was much too heavy. It was all the martial god muscles. Dethos planted his feet in the direction of the healing god's tents he could see set up in one of the mountain passes and tried to pull his patient along behind him. It didn't work. No matter how much he cajoled, threatened, pushed, or pulled, he wouldn't or couldn't move him. It was like Elgaldia had turned to stone. The second time Elgaldia was poisoned, things progressed quicker than the first time. His eyes that had previously shown signs of knowing where he was and what was going on became glassy before rolling back in his head once more. The jerky movements returned, and Elgaldia looked more like a human possessed by a ghost than a god. Dethos tried once more to move him, this time trying to get him onto the rain cloud. He once again summoned, but this too was to no avail. Touching him whilst he was like this proved to be a bad idea. Elgaldia pushed him away, and the god of wheat fell, slipping, on the pool of shimmering blood, scratching his legs and arms and hands on the jagged rocks. Pulsing red waves of energy, a level at which Elgaldia had yet to show, hit the secondary protective ward Dethos had set up outside the temple. It shattered completely as if it had been a window that a hammer had been thrown through. A considerable amount of power had been absorbed by the ward, but way more had passed through, damaging the temple that lay beyond. A huge chunk of the carefully tooled masonry fell from the roof, smashing on the mountainside below. Before Dethos could erect another or divert more energy to strengthening the original ward, Elgaldia started screaming once more. Muscles in his face and hands were spasming uncontrollably. Dethos wanted to rush forward once more and hold him in his arms, hold on to him, do anything to take the pain away. Sounds that were coming from him were from someone living in a land beyond pain, a land where pain overwhelmed every sense, where you lost who you were. Sound became indecipherable, a mishmash of white noise. Dry mouths where taste crumbled away to ash. Feather-like touch ignited further pain misread as burning. Although rolled back in his head, his eyes were still capable of seeing, but his brain had ceased decoding the information it was getting from them. There was too much information to process. Not being able to do anything to help him was killing Dethos. He didn't dare grab hold of him again in fear that he would hurt him further. Leaving him and going for help also wasn't an option because he was completely unable to defend himself effectively. Right now, Dethos wasn't too sure whether Elgaldi would even be able to tell friend from foe. He seemed to be reacting to stimuli reflexively. The Emperor of the Demon Realm was still out there. He was wounded, but still very capable of fighting. Golden ribbons of light twisted their way out of his hands once more as he tried to replace the secondary ward. Standing up to do it would have wasted more time, and he didn't dare use any magic on Elgaldia, whose red hue had shifted darker. His skin was taking on a maroon hue. Dethos didn't have to think of what would happen if he had, as hadn't he, as the freshly made God of War's powers exploded out of him once more. Dethos ducked down as low to the ground as he could, without getting himself further down the mountainside, without throwing himself further down the mountainside. Blood trickled down his forehead. He was now in a pit of his own. Where the magic had touched his skin left a nasty burn. Burn, though, was the least of his worries, as he felt the terror of his believers still trapped in the temple increase even more. A boulder had dislodged from the peak of the mountain, and it fell almost in slow motion towards the temple complex, gathering rock and stones and gravel as it did so. It was a close call, but Dethos managed to shore up the temple hard enough for any serious damage to be prevented, though it still left it half buried in debris. He was now furious. It didn't matter anymore how close their relationship was. It didn't matter if Elgaldia was under the control of a mind-altering demon-produced poison. That he couldn't control his actions. Everything they had been through didn't matter. No one fucking endangered his believers, his people, his temple. He couldn't afford to hold back, hoping to be able to recall Elgaldia back to his senses when he posed such a threat to everything Dethos literally existed in order to protect. The god of wheat swallowed past the painful lump in his throat. He could feel his own rage rising, powered by the prayers for defense from within. The prayers of the humans and the voices of the wheat dying around him weren't something he could ignore, just as Galdia couldn't leave the battlefield. What the humans wanted took priority over their own autonomy. Whether what he did next was brave or stupid was something that he would leave up to the historians of the future, just as he would all of his other actions of today. At that time, it seemed like there was no other choice. For there to be history, there had to be people who survived. Calling Elgaldi's name no longer garnered any kind of reaction at all. Dethos called on his own power once more, trying as he did with Bulmar to hold on to Elgaldia with plants, but they were quickly incinerated. His only path now was to draw out two balls of pure golden light from his chest with his hands. The first he threw at the temple, where it absorbed into the defences there. Wads that had glowed bright enough that it looked like they were the sun. It hurt his eyes to look at. The other ball he propelled through the thick black clouds of energy the god of war was now producing. Tethos hoped the familiar feeling of his power without the pain from his touch, and the purity of the intent he had poured into it, would help bring Elgaldia back. Help him begin to throw off the poison's effects once more. Help him calm down just enough that he could get him actual help. Help that knew what it was doing. It didn't work. It did, in fact, become a lot worse. Elgaldi had closed the space between them faster than he could have ever expected. Had the smoke not been so thick, and had he not still been on the floor, maybe. Life was full of what ifs. It was also full of regret. Wide-eyed and slack-faced, Elgalde flew at him, sword brandished and shaking hands pointed towards Dethos. There wasn't time. He threw everything he had at the ward. It's just me, he said, closing his eyes. The boy with the camellia petals in his hair. The memory within a memory unfolds itself in his mind's eye of a younger Elgaldia fishing a red petal from his hair. The sky, he thought, as he looked up from the place he lay bleeding. I never noticed how blue the sky is. And then it was done. His time as a god was over. Mini theatre. Mason. How could they do this to my masterpiece? Farmer stares pointedly at ruined farmland. End of chapter 40. And that is where we end for today. My throat is truly, truly gone. Thank you to everyone who followed today. Thank you to Twisting Data and Integer. Thank you to Brooke for being here. Thank you to Helen for being here. Thank you to Peach, and to Kristen, and to Ellie. That's just a cute email. We got past the I think that's purely the most bloody part of the story, and it will get better from there. Gold stars to everyone who got through the bloody part of the story, because it was a lot. I'm gonna say night night. Sleep tight. Don't let anyone bite unless you want them to. Stay safe out there. Wash those handies because we're right in the middle of flu season right now. Don't run with scissors and be safe. Night night. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye bye. Oh, I will probably stream some point next week. I don't know when, but it will happen. Bye bye.